The mountain was trying to kill them all. RPG smoke hung over the convoy like a funeral shroud. Men screamed into radios, rocks split apart under machine gun fire. And in the middle of that dying chaos, a woman pressed her cheek to a rifle stock and breathed, slow, measured, almost bored, while the world detonated around her. Her commander had told her she wasn't a sniper. He told her to fall back, to stay behind, to leave the shooting to people who knew what they were doing. She heard him, she just didn't move. What happened next would force every man on that ridge to question everything they thought they understood about skill, about merit, and about who gets to decide who belongs in the fight. If that kind of story is what you're here for, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels. Now, let's begin. The briefing room at FOB smelled like burnt coffee and old sweat, which meant it smelled like every other briefing room Maya Vance had ever sat in. She took a seat near the back, not by choice, but by unspoken rule. The SEALs up front owned the room the way they owned everything, the good gear, the mission priority, the institutional assumption that they were the most important people in any building they walked into. Maya didn't resent it exactly. She understood how it worked. Tribal, hierarchical, built on shared suffering that outsiders hadn't earned the right to reference. She respected that. She just wished they'd extend the same consideration. The unit patch on her shoulder, 3rd Special Forces Group, with her attached sniper team designation below it, was technically the same tier of access as the men in front of her. Technically. Lieutenant Commander Ethan Cross entered the room without announcing himself, which was his way of reminding everyone who owned the air inside it. He was 41, sharp jaw going slightly soft under field rations, and not enough sleep, a scar running through his left eyebrow, from something that never made it into the official report. He had a presence that most operators develop over a decade of not dying when they should have. The particular gravity of a man who had already made the most important decision of his life many times over. He didn't look at Maya when he dropped his tablet on the briefing table. Most of them didn't. Kunar Ridge. Cross clicked to the terrain map. The valley materialized on the screen, narrow, switchbacked, the kind of terrain that looked like a mistake on a map and a catastrophe in person. Assets on the ground confirm HVT movement through the valley floor. We're running a convoy intercept, extract the package, punch out before their QRF gets any ideas. Wheels up in 90. He pointed at sectors without looking at anyone specifically. Petty Officer Delgado runs point element. Harris, Overwatch North. Reyes and Tuck, rear security. A pause. The sniper attachment covers the high ground on approach Delta. Coordinates are in your kits. He said the sniper attachment the way someone might say the weather forecast. Necessary information, no emotional content attached. Maya wrote nothing down. She'd had the coordinates memorized since 0400. The MH-60 insertion dropped them 3 kilometers from the valley mouth at 1340 local. The rotors faded fast, swallowed by wind and distance, and then it was just the team moving through broken shale and dry scrub under a sky bleached white by altitude sun. Maya moved behind Petty Officer Harris, a bear-sized man from Shreveport who had made it visibly clear he didn't think she should be there. Not in any single dramatic statement. It was smaller than that. The way he adjusted his spacing so she always had too much gap behind her. The way he angled his body when Cross gave out assignments, blocking her sightline just enough to make her feel like she was watching through a window. She matched his pace and said nothing. This wasn't new. The valley narrowed 0.5 kilometer ahead and the shadows went cold. Good ambush country. Maya could feel it the way she always felt it, a specific tightening across her shoulders, the same one that had first showed up years ago and hadn't left since. She scanned the ridgeline as she walked, methodical, left-to-right sweeps that she kept as natural-looking as possible. Obvious scanning got you picked off by counter-snipers. You learned to use your peripheral vision and trust it. She trusted it right now. Cross. She kept her voice low. He was 4 meters ahead. He didn't slow. What? Left ridgeline, approximately 40 meters past the first saddle. There's a notch in the rock that doesn't match the terrain survey. Lots of things don't match terrain surveys. This one's got a thermal shadow behind it. That made him slow. Not stop. Slow. He brought his binos up without breaking stride, scanned for 2 seconds, then lowered them. I don't see anything. The shadow moved 3 minutes ago. I've been watching it. Harris glanced over his shoulder at her. His expression was the specific one she'd cataloged, the here she goes face. She'd seen it on a dozen men in a dozen rooms. It didn't sting anymore. It just made her careful. Cross keyed his radio. All elements, slow your pace. Eyes on the high ground, North Ridge Line. He didn't say where the intel came from. 60 seconds later, P.O. Delgado's voice crackled through. Got something. Two-man element, North Ridge. They're glassing the valley. Cross said nothing for a moment. Maya said nothing either. The convoy found its overwatch positions and pushed another kilometer before Cross finally came back over comms. Vance? Sir? Next time you see something, you tell me faster. She could have said I told you 3 minutes ago. She didn't. Copy that. The ambush wasn't where anyone expected it. They were 200 meters from the valley floor, objective, when the first RPG came in from the east. Not the north. Not the elevated positions they'd been watching. East. A switchback trail nobody had flagged because it dead-ended on the map, except it didn't, not anymore. Someone had cleared a path through the rock in the last 72 hours. Someone with enough time and enough labor and enough intent to do it quietly. The round went long and hit the shale above Rhea's position. Rock shrapnel blew across 3 meters of trail. Reyes went down on one knee, hand over his face. Not dead, but not functional. Then the machine gun opened up. It came from a fold in the eastern face they should have flagged, a natural cut in the rock that created a covered firing position with clear angles on the trail approach. Professional placement. Maya had a half-second to register how good the setup was before she was already moving. She didn't run toward cover. She ran toward angle. 40 meters to the left and up, a boulder formation created an elevated platform that most people would look at and see obstacle. Maya looked at it and saw geometry. She was behind it and up before the second burst of machine gun fire crossed the trail. Shooter, eastern face, grid. She was already computing. 180 meters, natural fortified position, 2 fighters, 1 gun. Harris, take the shot. Cross's voice, flat and operational. Harris was good. Maya knew that. He got his rifle up in textbook time, took his breathing down, put rounds on target, and hit the rock face 18 inches left of the position because he was shooting through a thermal shimmer off the heated stone that his scope hadn't compensated for. 2 rounds, both wrong. Negative effect on target, Harris reported. Hold fire, set. Cross was running calculations. She could hear it in the silence between his transmissions. Vance, what's your position? Elevated 45-degree offset from target. I have a partial angle on the gun. Partial. I can work with it. Another burst of machine gun fire. It was walking across the trail toward Delgado's position. Delgado was pinned flat behind a rock outcropping that wasn't going to last much longer as cover. Vance, you are support attached. You are not, sir. Her voice came out low and entirely steady. Not aggressive, just certain. I have the angle. Harris doesn't. The gun is going to move in the next 30 seconds when they realize he's not hitting them. When it moves, Delgado's position is exposed. Cross came back fast. You certain about the movement? I'm certain about the geometry. Silence. 2 seconds of it, which was a lifetime in a firefight. Take it. Maya's world collapsed to a single point. She wasn't calculating consciously anymore. The data was already processed, filed, ready. Range, 182 adjusted for the thermal layer. Wind, 11 knots, quartering right, gust pattern cycling at roughly 6-second intervals. The gun was crew-served, 2 fighters, and they were repositioning. She could see it in the subtle shift of shadow at the firing port, the slight change in angle of the barrel. She waited for the gust to peak, let it drop, pulled the trigger in the half-second trough between gusts. The first round hit the gunner, the second hit the assistant gunner as he scrambled for the weapon. Neither of them got off another burst. The machine gun stopped. Delgado's position held. The team punched forward and cleared the valley floor in the next 4 minutes without losing anyone else. Afterward, 20 minutes after, when the adrenaline had metabolized enough that people could stand still and look at each other, Harris found her at the rally point. She was field stripping her rifle, which didn't need field stripping. It was something to do with her hands. That was a hell of a shot, Harris said. She looked up at him. He was watching her with an expression she didn't have a ready category for. Not the here she goes face. Not quite. 2 shots, she said. Yeah. He scratched the back of his neck. 2 shots. Then he walked away, and she kept stripping the rifle, and neither of them said anything else about it. Cross passed her on his way to the debrief setup and didn't speak. But he paused for one step, just one, in a way that meant he was aware of her, and she was aware of him, and both of them understood that something had shifted without being named yet. In the special operations world, recognition rarely looked like praise. More often it looked like being treated like you existed. That pause was enough. For now. The debrief happened in a partial ruin of a kalat that the team had used as a rally point before. Stone walls still standing to chest height, what remained of a roof providing maybe 40% cover from overhead. The late afternoon sun came in at a flat angle and turned everything amber and dusty gold. Chief Warrant Officer Damon Torres ran the debrief. He was the team's intelligence officer, small-framed and precise in the way that some soldiers grew into after too many years in rooms where one wrong analysis meant operators came home in bags. He wore the permanent expression of a man doing arithmetic. Ambush was staged from the east approach, Torres said, pointing at his map overlay. Pre-positioned, well-rehearsed. They knew our rough timeline, which means we've got an OPSEC issue at the planning layer, or we've got eyes on the fob. Either one's bad. He moved his finger. The trail breach is the concerning part. That section was impassable 72 hours ago, according to the imagery. Somebody put in significant labor to open it up. This wasn't improvised. Which means they've been planning an interdiction in this valley, Cross said, or they've been planning an interdiction on this convoy specifically. Torres let that land. We recovered a radio off one of the fighters. Language team is working it. The channel encryption is higher grade than what the standard militia networks have been using. Somebody's providing technical support to these guys. Cross looked at Maya. Not at her results, not at her shooting, at her face, the way you look at someone when you're trying to figure out what else they know. She didn't take the cue, because she wasn't in the habit of performing competence for audiences. The forward positions, she said when the pause got long enough. The ones on the north ridge that Delgado spotted. They weren't for the ambush. They were for early warning. Someone was watching to confirm we entered the valley before the eastern element triggered. Torres wrote something down. Walk me through that. 2-man cell on the north ridge with optics. That's a surveillance function, not a fire function. If they wanted to contribute to the ambush, they'd have been positioned to enfilade the trail, not observe it. They were there to watch us commit to the approach and relay confirmation. Confirmation to who? Harris said, not skeptically, like an actual question. To whoever staged the eastern element. The timing on the RPG was about 30 seconds after we crossed a specific terrain feature, a rock formation about 200 meters back. That formation is the last natural defilade before the approach opens up. We crossed it, and 30 seconds later the RPG came in. She looked at Torres. The North Ridge team gave the signal when we crossed that feature. The room was quiet. Cross looked at Torres. Torres was still writing. That's a coordinated, multi-element engagement with communications discipline, Torres said slowly. That's not a regular force TTPs. That's not militias. No, Maya said. It's not. Cross stood. He moved to the map and stared at it for a long moment, jaw working slightly, the way he did when he was processing something he didn't want to be true. Torres, get that radio to the signals team tonight. I want an analysis before the EO500 brief. He looked at his team. Everyone get eyes on rest. This valley stays hot until we understand what we're dealing with. He didn't look at Maya when he left, but he didn't not look at her either. That night, after the team had found their corners of the Kalat, and silence had fallen, the way it fell in cold mountains, heavy, pressing, alive with small sounds that weren't threats, but kept the threat assessment part of your brain from fully switching off. Maya sat with her back against stone and stared at a map she didn't need to stare at. She knew the terrain. She had the image already. What she was actually doing was thinking about the radio encryption Torres had mentioned, higher grade than standard militia networks, technical support from an external source, multi-element engagement with communications discipline. She'd seen that pattern before. Not here, not in this valley, not in Kunar specifically, but in reports. After-action reviews from 2 operations conducted by a different unit in a different province, both of which had ended with operators killed or captured in ambushes that, on paper, shouldn't have been sophisticated enough to work. She'd read those reports extensively in the 6 months before this deployment, mining them for tactical lessons. She remembered the signals section had flagged unusual encryption in both cases. Both times it had been attributed to gear captured from Western sources. Both times the investigation had closed without identifying the external support element. 2 could be coincidence. 3 was a pattern. She pulled out her small notebook, actual paper, which made Harris call her old-fashioned and which she discovered was the most reliable data storage in environments where electronics failed, and started writing. Not the analysis, which lived entirely in her head. The questions. The things she'd need Torres to pull from the signals data if the radio came back with anything useful. Outside, the wind picked up. Somewhere on the far ridge, north, above the saddle, a rock slid loose and fell. Maya's hand paused over the paper. She listened. The rock landed and the sound dissipated. Just the mountain settling. She went back to her notebook. But she didn't put her rifle out of arm's reach. Not tonight. 2 days later, Torres's analysis came back. The radio recovered from the Eastern ambush element used a frequency-hopping protocol that had last appeared, officially, in signals traffic attributed to a Pakistani intelligence service operation along the border 8 months ago. The operation had ostensibly concluded. The encryption variant hadn't been seen since, until now. Cross read the report twice and said nothing for approximately 40 seconds, which was his equivalent of alarm. "We take this up the chain," he said. "This morning." "That'll take the valley off our operational scope," Torres said. "I know what it'll do." "Sir," Maya kept her voice measured, "if we hand this up and the analysis gets buried, which it will, if the wrong people are reading it, whoever's running that external support net is still active in this sector. And they know we're here. They staged an ambush on this convoy specifically. If we go dark and pull back, they'll assume they succeeded in chasing us off, and they'll accelerate their timeline." Cross looked at her, full attention this time, the kind of look that didn't have the temperature of dismissal in it. "And if we stay," he said, "we're operating in a valley where somebody is running professional-grade coordination against us with signals capability we don't fully understand." "Yes, sir." "Those are both bad options, Vance." "I know." She didn't flinch. "I'm not saying one of them isn't bad. I'm saying one of them gives us information and one of them doesn't." The silence that followed wasn't the silence of her being ignored. She recognized the difference by now. This was the silence of a decision being turned over. "Pull the imagery from the last 72 hours, Cross said finally. Not to her specifically, but he wasn't looking away from her when he said it. "I want eyes on every approach to this valley before we have the 0900 brief. And somebody wake up Delgado. I want him running a pattern analysis on the early warning positions." He moved past her toward the comms station. "Vance?" She stopped. "The coordinates you have memorized." He said it flatly. "For Delta approach. You had those before the brief." "Yes, sir." "How long before?" "Since 0400, the day before the mission." He processed that. "You were running your own terrain analysis." "I run my own terrain analysis on every operation I'm attached to, sir. It's not—" She caught herself before remarkable came out, because that was the wrong word and she knew it. It's standard preparation. It's not standard for the support attachment to prep above their assignment. Maybe it should be. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face. Not warmth, exactly, but a specific recalibration that she recognized because she'd seen it happen in men before, usually later than it should have, but at least it happened. "Get your kit sorted," he said. "We brief in 40. He walked away. Maya stood in the amber light of early morning, filtering through the Kalat's collapsed roof, dust turning in the air where he'd disturbed it, and allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to feel what that exchange had cost her to have. The restraint, the patience, the careful precision of navigating a space where every wrong word would be used to confirm what they already believed about her. 3 seconds. Then she went and got her kit. The pattern analysis came back at 0830, 30 minutes before the brief Cross had called. Delgado laid it out on the map overlay with the systematic thoroughness of a man who found comfort in data. The early warning positions in the valley had been occupied, based on thermal imaging cycles, for at least 4 days before the ambush. 4 days. Not an improvised response to intelligence about the convoy. A deliberate, patient surveillance operation that had been watching the valley approaches and waiting for a target of sufficient value. They weren't watching for us specifically, Delgado said. They were watching for anyone coming through this route. We were the first qualifying target in 4 days. Qualifying how? Torres asked. Size of element, equipment profile, vehicle type. Delgado pointed at the imagery. The 2 convoys that used this route in the 4 days prior were local, civilian trucks, minimal security. Neither triggered the ambush. We came through with a full tactical element, and they activated. Maya was looking at the imagery from a different angle. What's at the far end of the valley? Delgado looked at her. Access road to the Coast Guardez Pass. What's on that road right now? He pulled up a different layer, held it for a moment. A civilian aid convoy. 3 vehicles. They've been staged at the pass entry for 2 days, waiting for security clearance. The room went quiet. Cross straightened up from the table. They're not watching for tactical elements. They're watching for whatever comes through this valley toward that pass. He looked at Torres. The HVT we were briefed on, the movement through the valley floor, was either wrong intelligence, Torres said, finishing it, or it was planted. To bring us in. Cross stood very still. To use us as early reconnaissance. We enter the valley. The surveillance team confirms it's viable for large element movement. And then he stopped. Then they use the same route, Maya said quietly, to move something through, after we've confirmed it's passable. Cross looked at her. She looked at the map. The aid convoy at the pass. Waiting for clearance. 2 days staged. Sir, she said, we need to look at what's in those vehicles. The silence that followed wasn't the comfortable kind. Cross was already moving to the comm station before Maya finished the sentence. He pulled the handset and keyed the fob operations frequency, keeping his voice low and flat, the way operators did when they were reporting something they didn't fully want to be true yet. Kestrel Actual, this is Cross. I need a hold order on the KG Pass civilian convoy. 3 vehicles, staged at the entry point. Do not clear them through until I have eyes on confirmation. How copy? Static. Then, Cross, this is Kestrel Actual. That convoy has NGO documentation and State Department liaison clearance. On what basis are you requesting a hold? On the basis that I think somebody used our entry into Kunar Valley to confirm the route for movement of unknown cargo, and that convoy has been staged at that pass for 2 days without explanation. More static, a longer pause. Stand by. Cross set the handset down without hanging it up. He turned to Torres. Get me everything we have on that NGO. Registration, personnel manifest, the name of whoever signed off on the state liaison clearance. I want it in 10 minutes. Torres was already on his laptop. Maya was still looking at the map. The valley route to the Coast Guardez Pass was one of the few approaches in this sector that could handle 3 vehicles moving in convoy without satellite coverage for approximately 40 minutes. A natural gap created by ridge topography that interrupted line of sight for most of the overhead assets. She'd noted it in her terrain analysis at 0400 2 days ago. She hadn't flagged it then because it was background information, the kind of thing you filed without knowing why yet. She knew why now. The coverage gap, she said. Delgado looked at her. The imagery gap created by the ridgeline, 40 minutes of no overhead coverage on the valley approach to the pass. If you're moving something you don't want photographed, that's your window. And that window opens, she checked the sun angle, calculated. In about 3 hours. Nobody spoke. Torres, Cross said very quietly. Working on it, sir. The NGO registration came back clean. Too clean, Torres said, which in intelligence work meant something specific. The kind of documentation that was complete in every field, stamped on every page, without the minor inconsistencies that actual organizational paperwork always carried because actual people filled it out in a hurry, made small errors, corrected them, left traces. This documentation had no traces. Shell organization, Torres said, recently established. The registration address in Kabul maps to a building that burned down 14 months ago. Nobody flagged it because the paperwork referenced the correct district authority. Cargo manifest, Cross said. Medical supplies, vaccines, cold chain transport equipment. Verify the cold chain equipment. I can't verify it without eyes on the vehicles. Then we need eyes on the vehicles. The problem was the vehicles were at the pass entry, which was 6 kilometers from their current position, and sending an element that direction openly would either spook whoever was running the convoy or blow their cover position entirely. If the convoy was what Torres suspected, and what Maya suspected, and what Cross was now, reluctantly, carefully, beginning to suspect, then whoever was running it had enough surveillance capability to notice a tactical element repositioning toward their location. They needed eyes on, without movement. "What's the elevation on the south ridgeline above the pass entry?" Maya asked. Delgado pulled the topographic layer. 1,400 meters at the highest point. The entry staging area is at 960. So 440 meters of elevation advantage. She was already doing the geometry. At that angle, from the south ridge, what's the line of sight to the vehicle staging area? Delgado measured it on the overlay. Direct. No terrain interference. And the distance from the south ridge high point to the staging area. He measured again. His expression changed slightly. 1,100 meters. Harris looked at her from across the table. That's a long glass. "I'm not talking about shooting anything," she said. "I'm talking about observation. At 1,100 meters with a good scope and stable conditions, I can read cargo markings on the side of a vehicle. I can count personnel. I can tell you if those cold chain containers are the right size for what they're claiming to carry, and whether the vehicle suspensions are sitting low enough to suggest they're loaded with something heavier than vaccines." She said it plainly, without emphasis, the way you'd say anything that was simply true. Cross looked at Delgado. Delgado looked at his calculations and then at Maya and gave a small nod that meant the geometry works. "Two-person element," Cross said. "Vance and Torres. South Ridge observation post. You have 90 minutes to get into position before the coverage gap opens." He looked at Torres. "Document everything. If those vehicles are running something, I want imagery and written log before we make any call on interdiction." Back to Maya. "You see anything that suggests they're moving, you call it immediately. You do not engage. Observation only." "Understood." "If the route into position crosses open ground, it doesn't." She had the image already. "There's a drainage line running north-south along the west face of the south ridge. It's below the sight lines from the pass entry for the entire approach. We stay in the drainage until we're within 200 meters of the ridgeline, then we use the rock formations as cover for the final ascent." Cross stared at her. She waited. "How long have you known about the drainage line?" "Since 0400 2 days ago." Something moved across his face again. That recalibration. Slower this time, like he was finally acknowledging something he'd been resisting. "Move," he said. Oh, the drainage line was exactly what the terrain analysis had promised. A narrow cut running between two rock faces, deep enough to keep them below sight lines, filled with the kind of ankle-turning loose shale that made every step a negotiation. Maya moved through it with her rifle slung and her eyes forward, picking her footfalls the way she'd been doing since the mountains of North Carolina, where she'd first learned to move without sound. Torres moved well for an intelligence officer, better than she'd expected. He kept pace without complaint and didn't try to fill the silence with conversation, which immediately raised her opinion of him. They didn't speak until they were halfway up the final ascent, and Torres crouched behind a boulder to check his camera kit. "Cross didn't want to send you," he said. "Not accusatory, just informational." "I know." Changed his mind fast. The geometry was persuasive. She was scanning the ridgeline above them, checking angles. "How long have you been working with this unit?" 7 months, he tightened a lens cap. "You?" "Attached 3 weeks ago." He looked at her. "You prepped the terrain analysis for this entire sector in 3 weeks." "I prepped it before I arrived." He was quiet for a moment, then, "The drainage line, the coverage gap, the early warning position pattern this morning." He wasn't accusing her of anything. He was, she realized, cataloging. "You came into this deployment with a working analysis of this valley." "I came into this deployment with a working analysis of this entire operational sector," she said, "which I built over the 6 months before we deployed, which is what I do." She looked at him. "Did you think I didn't prepare?" "I didn't think about it either way," he said. And she believed him, because Torres was the kind of man who could honestly admit that something had been outside his consideration without making it an apology. "I'm thinking about it now." "Good," she said. "Let's move." The observation post was a natural shelf in the rock. 18 inches of flat surface tucked behind a formation that gave her a shooting rest without requiring her to use her pack. Maya settled into it with the unhurried precision of long practice. Not performance, just efficiency. Every movement deliberate, no wasted motion. Rifle up, scope to her eye, adjustments made in the automatic language of 1,000 hours of preparation. The vehicle staging area swam into focus at the bottom of the scope. 3 trucks. Canvas-sided, military surplus frames, the kind that moved anonymously through this region by the hundreds. The cargo containers were white with blue medical crosses. 4 personnel visible, 2 standing near the lead vehicle, 1 sitting in the cab of the second, 1 walking a slow perimeter that was trying to look casual and not quite managing it. The way he walked the perimeter was the first wrong thing. Perimeter walking for a humanitarian convoy waiting on clearance was a specific kind of body language, bored, distracted, frequently interrupted by phone checking or conversation. What this man was doing was deliberate and patterned, 12-step intervals, 90-degree turns, consistent arc of his head movement. That was security walking. That was threat assessment. "Torres," she said quietly. "Third vehicle from the front, right rear wheel well. Can you get imagery on the suspension?" Torres adjusted his camera, paused. "The suspension is sitting low." "How low?" "Lower than cold chain equipment and standard medical supplies would put it." Maya shifted her scope to the cargo containers on the second truck. The blue medical crosses were stenciled cleanly. Too cleanly. The same too clean quality as Torres's documentation analysis. Real NGO equipment, used in the field, showed weathering, paint wear at the edges of markings, the kind of minor damage that happened when containers were loaded and unloaded repeatedly. These containers looked like they'd never been unloaded. She moved her scope to the personnel. The man nearest the lead vehicle was talking. She couldn't hear him. 1,100 meters of open mountain air and wind between them. But she could read the angle of his head, the way he held his hand near his collar. Not a phone. A radio. "He's on comms," she said. Torres's camera clicked. "The containers," Maya said. "Second truck, passenger side. Top right corner of the forward container. There's a seam line that doesn't match the design." Torres found it. Another click. "Modified container." "The interior's been partitioned," she said. "The seam is where the partition meets the outer wall. They built a false interior to preserve the exterior profile of a standard medical container." Torres looked up from his camera. "What's in the real interior?" She didn't speculate out loud. Speculation wasn't her job right now. Documentation was. "Get everything you have and keep shooting. I'm going to call Cross." She relayed the observation in tight, professional language. No interpretation, just description. Suspension profile, container modification, security patrol pattern, comms activity. Cross listened without interrupting, which meant he was writing. When she finished, he said, "Confidence level. On the containers being modified, high. On what's inside, but I can't tell you from here, but the modification is intentional and recent." Timeline. She checked the sun angle. Coverage gap opens in 61 minutes. If they're moving during the gap, they'll need to be rolling within the hour to clear the valley before satellite coverage resumes. A pause on Cross's end. Then, "What's your shot angle on the vehicle staging area from your current position?" She felt the question land before she processed it. "Sir, you told me this was observation only." "I'm asking you a contingency question, Vance. What's your angle?" She ran the geometry. "I have clear line of sight on all 3 vehicles and all visible personnel. At this distance, wind conditions are," she checked, 13 knots, right to left, gusting, variable. The distance is significant. I'd have to account for significant bullet drop and a drift window that's going to be inconsistent. "Can you do it?" She was quiet for exactly the length of time it took her to be honest with herself. "At 1,300 meters with a gusting crosswind, I can put rounds on target with high reliability on stationary targets. Moving targets at that distance in these wind conditions. My confidence drops." "That's honest?" "Yes, sir." "Hold your position. I'm working the interdiction option through the chain. Don't move until you hear from me." The radio went quiet. Torres looked at her. "Interdiction means—" "They're thinking about stopping those vehicles before they move." She kept her eye to the scope. "If the chain approves it." "And if they don't approve it in time?" She watched the security man complete another patrol circuit below. Then we watch 3 trucks drive through a coverage gap carrying whatever they're carrying, and we document them doing it, and the analysis team works it backward from the imagery. And whoever's in those trucks gets where they're going. Yes. Torres was quiet. Then, does that bother you? She didn't answer immediately. Beneath her, the staging area sat motionless in the hard mountain light. The security man had stopped his circuit and was standing very still, looking up at the ridgeline. Not at her position, 20 degrees to the left, but up. They knew there were ridges. Get down, she said quietly. Torres was already moving before the word finished. Below them, the security man spoke into his collar. His posture had changed, that specific tightening that happened in a body when threat assessment shifted from passive to active. Maya stayed motionless behind the rock, scope down, presenting as little profile as the terrain allowed. Her radio crackled. Cross's voice fast and clipped. Vance. The chain is requesting confirmation of container modification before they'll authorize interdiction. They want imagery transmitted in the next 15 minutes or the window closes. She looked at Torres. His camera had the imagery. The transmission equipment was in his kit. The problem was that transmitting, even on a burst protocol, required Torres to raise his antenna 12 inches above the rock line. And the man below was still watching the ridge lines. Torres, she said very quietly, how fast can you burst transmit on the encrypted channel? 18 seconds to compile and send. How high does the antenna need to go? He checked his kit. 14 inches above my current position. She looked at the angle of the sun, at the rock formation above them, at the shadow line that the formation threw across their position. Wait, she said. Torres waited. She counted. 15 seconds. 20. The shadow shifted with the sun's movement, almost imperceptible, but real. The rock formation's shadow crossed their position, and the antenna raise point fell into it. Now, she said. Do it now. Torres raised the antenna and transmitted. 18 seconds. The antenna came down. Below them, the security man completed one more scan of the ridge lines, found nothing that satisfied whatever he was looking for, and went back to his patrol circuit. Torres exhaled. Maya didn't. She was watching the lead vehicle. The driver had climbed into the cab. The engine started. She could see the exhaust at this distance, a thin smear of dark against the pale dust of the staging area. They were preparing to move. She keyed her radio. Cross, the convoy is preparing to roll. Whatever the chain is going to decide, they have about 4 minutes. Cross's response was immediate. The imagery is being reviewed now. Stand by. Stand by. She watched the second vehicle's engine start. Then the third, all 3 trucks running, cargo loaded, personnel mounting up. The security man she'd been watching climbing into the lead vehicle's cab. Not the back, the front. He was driving, which meant he was either the most trusted person in that element or the most dispensable. And in her experience, lead vehicle on a sensitive cargo run was always one or the other. Cross, she kept her voice flat. They are moving. The trucks began to roll. Cross, the convoy is in motion. They're heading for the valley approach. I have maybe 90 seconds before they're into the terrain and I lose line of sight. Static. Then a voice she didn't recognize, not Cross. An older voice, clipped and authoritative. Vance, this is Colonel Hayes, FOB Kestrel. I'm looking at your imagery. One question. How confident are you in the container modification assessment? 90 seconds. Maybe 80. Now. Very confident, sir. The seam line is inconsistent with the manufacturing standard for that container type. The modification is intentional. You're familiar with the manufacturing standard. I researched it 6 months ago when I was prepping the sector analysis. It's in my written assessment, which is in the FOB intelligence files under my name. A pause. 5 seconds. Which was 75 seconds of window becoming 70. Who authorized an attached sniper to run an independent sector analysis. The trucks were moving. She could see them picking up speed on the approach road. Nobody, sir. I did it on my own time because I thought it was necessary. Another pause. 60 seconds of window becoming 55. Colonel, she said, and her voice came out with an edge she didn't entirely suppress. With respect, those trucks are moving. If you're going to authorize interdiction, the window is closing right now. Silence on the channel. Then Hayes's voice, flat and final. Vance, You have a shot? She was already moving back to the rifle. Yes, sir. The lead vehicle. Disable it. Copy. The lead truck was 400 meters into the valley approach. Moving, not fast. The road was rough, and the driver knew it, but moving. Target velocity, maybe 15 kilometers per hour. Range now from her position, 1,300 and rising as the truck moved away from her. Wind, still gusting, 12 to 14 knots, right to left. She had one shot before the truck entered the first bend and disappeared into the valley terrain. One shot to disable a moving vehicle at 1,300 and growing meters in gusting crosswind conditions. Maya steadied her breathing. The world went very quiet. She calculated the lead. She calculated the drift. She felt the gust cycle, counted the interval, found the pattern, waited for the trough. The truck hit a rough patch in the road and slowed slightly. She fired. The round traveled for just over a second at that distance. It hit the lead vehicle's engine block. The truck stopped. The two behind it stopped. Nowhere to go. The valley approach was single lane. Cross's voice came through immediately, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she heard something in it she hadn't heard before. Not warmth, not praise, but a specific directness that meant he was talking to someone he'd decided was real. All elements, this is Cross. Move to interdict. 3 vehicles, valley approach, lead vehicle disabled. Move now. The team moved. Maya kept her scope on the staging area and watched the men climbing out of the stopped trucks. 4 of them, hands going up, the security man from the lead vehicle standing very still, with his hands visible, and his face doing the calculation of someone who had just run out of options. Torres was already transmitting the real-time imagery. Below her, in the hard mountain light, the mission that was supposed to be straightforward became the mission that wasn't, and the thing hidden in those containers, whatever it was, wasn't going anywhere. Neither was Maya Vance. She stayed at the scope until the team reached the vehicles. She stayed until Torres confirmed transmission complete. She stayed until Cross came on the radio one more time and said, with the economy of a man who didn't use words carelessly, "Good shot, Vance." 2 words. She'd heard worse endorsements. She'd heard better. Right now, in the thin mountain air with the wind still cutting across the ridge and the sun dropping toward the western peaks, 2 words from Ethan Cross were enough to mean that something had changed. Not everything, not permanently, and definitely not without the work it would still take to make it stick. But something. She began breaking down her position, methodical, patient, the same way she did everything. And below her, at the disabled lead vehicle, the cargo doors opened. The team's radio traffic went quiet for a moment. That specific silence that meant the men on the ground were seeing something that took a second to process. Then Torres's voice, precise and entirely flat, came through on the channel she was still monitoring. "Cross, you need to see this." The cargo doors swung open and the smell hit them before the visuals did. Metal and grease and something chemical underneath, sharp enough to cut through the thin mountain air. Cross stood at the rear of the lead vehicle with his hand braced against the doorframe and looked at what was inside for a long moment without speaking. The containers weren't medical, they were weapons crates. Not the improvised kind, not the battlefield scavenged kind. Manufactured. Stenciled with alphanumeric codes that Torres was already photographing and cross-referencing before Cross had finished his first full look. The crates were padded, shock-mounted inside modified cold chain containers. The false interiors Maya had identified from 1,100 meters through a gusting crosswind, and there were 12 of them across the 3 vehicles. Harris pulled the top off the nearest crate. Manpad components. Shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile systems, broken down for transport, but complete. Launchers, seekers, grip stocks, still in their factory packaging. The foam padding was pristine. These hadn't been used. They were en route to someone who was going to use them. "Torres," Cross said, "working on the stencil codes now." Torres didn't look up from his camera. "Give me 10 minutes." "You have 5. Cross walked away from the vehicle. He walked far enough that the cluster of personnel around the cargo couldn't hear him, then stopped and stood with his back to them, looking at the valley approach where the dust of the stopped convoy still hadn't fully settled. 12 Manpad systems. In this sector. Moving through a route they'd confirmed was passable by running a tactical element through it first. He stood there long enough that Delgado came over and stood beside him. "Sir?" "I know." "That's enough to take down." "I know what it's enough to do, Delgado. Delgado went quiet. Cross turned around and looked up at the south ridgeline, at the rock formation where he knew Maya and Torres had set up their observation post. At this distance, he couldn't see them. She had chosen the position well enough that she was essentially invisible from ground level, which was exactly the point. He stood there looking at the ridgeline for a moment that went slightly longer than operational necessity required. Then he went back to the vehicles and started documenting. Maya came down from the ridge 40 minutes later, Torres behind her with the camera kit and his notebook, and the careful expression of a man who had been adding up a column of numbers and kept getting the same alarming total. The descent through the drainage line was harder going down. The shale shifted underfoot and wanted to move you faster than was safe, and Maya had spent enough time in mountain terrain to know that most injuries happened on the way back, when you were tired and the ground knew it. She took her time. Torres didn't rush her. When they reached the valley floor and walked toward the vehicle staging area, the scene had the organized chaos of a post-interdiction site. Evidence markers going down, personnel being zip-tied and seated along the vehicle line, Harris running a sweep of the cab interiors while Reyes covered the detainees. The security man from the lead vehicle, Saab, the one who'd been walking the careful patrol circuits that had told Maya everything she needed to know about his actual function, was sitting against the front tire with his wrists bound and his face doing nothing at all. The specific blankness of a professional who had accepted a bad outcome and was now in conservation mode. Cross was at the second vehicle with Torres's camera in his hand, reviewing the imagery Torres had transmitted. He looked up when he heard them approach. He handed the camera back to Torres without comment and looked at Maya. "The seam line on the container," he said. "How did you see that at that distance?" "It was visible. At 1,100 meters in ambient mountain light on a white surface." "Yes." He waited for more. She didn't offer any. "I'm not questioning whether you saw it," he said, and his voice had shifted into something that wasn't quite frustration and wasn't quite respect, and was probably both operating in the same space without enough room. "I'm asking because in 15 years of doing this job, I've never seen anyone identify a structural modification on a container at that range." "I wasn't looking for the modification specifically. I was looking at everything that was wrong with the visual profile of those containers and working out what each wrong thing meant. The seam was one of 4 indicators." "What were the other 3? She told him. "The weathering pattern inconsistent with field use, the stacking configuration that loaded more weight toward the rear, which made sense if the real cargo was forward of a partition and you needed to counterbalance it. The way the second truck's suspension sat relative to the first and third, which suggested uneven load distribution inconsistent with a uniform cargo of medical supplies." Cross listened. His jaw worked once, which was the only external sign of whatever he was doing internally. "You put all of that together in real time?" "I put most of it together on the way up the ridge. The seam I saw once I had the scope on the vehicle." Harris had come over during the last half of it. She registered him at the edge of her vision but didn't turn. "So you're telling me," Harris said, "that before you even had your eye in the scope, you'd already figured out those containers were wrong?" "I'd assessed that there was a significant probability the containers were wrong. The scope confirmed it." Harris had the expression again. Not the here she goes face this time. The other one, the one she didn't have a ready category for. He'd worn it briefly after the ambush shots and then put it away. Now it was back, and it was staying longer. "Why didn't you say anything on the walk up?" he said. "Because I didn't have confirmation. An assessment without confirmation is conjecture, and conjecture in an operational context creates bias. If I'd told Torres I thought the containers were modified before I had scope confirmation, he'd have been looking for confirmation instead of looking at everything with fresh eyes. His independent observation was more valuable than my early assessment. The 3 of them, Cross, Harris, Torres, all stood with that for a moment. Torres, who had documented everything and said relatively little since they'd come down from the ridge, said, "She's right. When she called the seam, I found it independently. If she'd told me what to look for, I'd have looked for it and found it and called it confirmed. That's confirmation bias." Her read was cleaner. Cross looked at Torres, then at Maya. "Get some water," he said. "Debrief in 30. He walked back to the vehicles. Harris stood where he was for a moment. Maya was already moving toward where Reyes had set up a water point near the rear of the element. She heard Harris behind her, not following her exactly, but moving in the same direction. "Vance?" She stopped. Where'd you learn to do that? The observation stuff. The bias thing. She turned halfway toward him. School. Which school? Every school I ever went to. She paused. And some I put myself through. She kept walking. Harris watched her go with that expression that still didn't have a name, then turned back to his vehicle sweep. The debrief happened in the open, which was unusual and which Cross explained by saying he wanted the full team present and the site still needed to be worked, so they'd work both at once. Personnel from the interdiction stood in a loose perimeter while Torres ran through the documentation. Cross stood with his arms crossed and his weight slightly forward, the posture of a man who was about to deliver information that nobody was going to enjoy. The stencil codes on the weapons crates, Torres said, traced to a production batch that was reported destroyed in a facility fire 18 months ago. The investigation closed on the destruction because the manifest counts matched the reported casualty. What that means is somebody pulled the systems before the fire, reported them destroyed, and has been sitting on them. Sitting on them or moving them, Delgado said. Moving them. This isn't the first shipment. Based on the crate numbering sequence, these 12 units are numbers 37 through 48 in a batch of at least 60. The first 36 went somewhere before these. The team absorbed that. 36 man-pad systems already in distribution, Reyes said, in this sector. Minimum 36. We don't know what batch count the first shipment started at. Cross let the silence sit for 3 seconds, which was his version of letting information fully land before moving past it. The facility fire. Where? Eastern Kandahar province. The facility was a contracted logistics hub. Private company, 3-year DoD contract for equipment storage and transport coordination. Torres checked his notes. The company is listed as inactive now, dissolved 8 months after the fire. Who owned it? The registered ownership is a holding structure, 3 shell layers deep. The intelligence team at Bagram is working backward through it, but the structure is sophisticated enough that it's going to take time. Torres looked up. This wasn't set up in a hurry. The shell structure, the fake NGO documentation, the frequency hopping radio protocol, the early warning surveillance network. This has been running for a long time by people who knew what they were doing. Cross looked at his team. Any questions? Harris raised a hand. The first 36 units. Do we have any incident reports in this sector that could match the capabilities those systems would represent? Torres's expression shifted slightly. The particular shift of a man confirming something he'd been hoping was wrong. 3 aircraft incidents in the past 14 months in adjacent sectors. 2 classified as mechanical failure, 1 as crew error. All 3 investigations closed. The silence that followed had a different texture than the previous ones. Maya was standing at the edge of the group, water bottle in her hand, and she had been doing what she always did in debriefs, present, quiet, watching the room rather than just the briefer. She watched Cross process the aircraft information, watched the exact moment he connected it to something, and the connection wasn't good news. Torres, Cross said. 14 months ago. What was this first aircraft incident? Torres checked. His jaw tightened. A CH-47 inbound to FOB Salerno, classified as mechanical failure. Crew of 4. No survivors. The team went quiet in the particular way that teams went quiet when the abstraction of intelligence data collided with something that had been a person, several people, that someone in the chain knew or had known. Cross uncrossed his arms. He put his hands in his pockets, which she'd learned was what he did when he was controlling something. Recommendations. It wasn't directed at anyone. Open question. Delgado went first. Full intelligence handoff to Bagram. This is above our operational scope. Agreed, Torres said, with the caveat that the handoff has to be tight. If there's a compromise somewhere in the planning layer, which there is, because that ambush was staged specifically on our convoy, then a wide distribution of this intelligence may alert whoever's running the supply network. Controlled handoff, Cross said. Agreed. What else? The detainees, Harris said. The driver of the lead vehicle is the one to work. He's the most senior based on his vehicle position and the way the others are deferring to him. He's also the one who identified that somebody was on the ridgeline. He was the one I watched scanning upward before we called Vance and Torres down. He know anything? He knows more than the others. How much more is the question? Cross nodded. Torres, you're on the lead detainee. Standard approach. Take your time. He looked around the group. Anything else? The pause that followed was the kind where people were deciding whether to say the thing they were thinking. Maya said it. The NGO documentation listed a contact at the State Department liaison office, the name on the clearance approval. I saw it, Torres said. Has anyone flagged it? Not yet. It needs to be flagged. Whoever approved clearance for this convoy either made a very significant error or is involved. Either way, the liaison office is part of the chain. Cross looked at her. You're suggesting we potentially flag a State Department officer as either compromised or negligent. I'm suggesting that the clearance approval is part of the evidence chain and should be treated as such. She held his look. If I'm wrong, the investigation clears it. If I'm not wrong and we don't flag it, that office stays in position. The team was watching her. She could feel it without looking around. The particular quality of attention that meant she'd said something that landed in a place people hadn't expected it to land. Cross said nothing for 4 seconds. Add it to the handoff package, he said. Torres, make sure the flagging language is precise. Potential compromise, not confirmed. We're not accusing anyone. Copy. All right. Cross looked at the valley. We're here until Bagram sends an extraction for the cargo and detainees. That's 4 hours minimum. I want security perimeter maintained, I want the vehicles documented from every angle before anything moves, and I want everyone rotated for rest in 2-hour windows. He paused. Vance? Sir? You're off rotation for the first 2 hours. That ridge climb and the observation post. Rest. It wasn't asked. I'm fine, sir. That's not what I said. She held the look for a half-second. Copy. He walked away. Harris fell into step beside her and she waited for whatever was coming. He's not trying to sideline you, Harris said, quietly enough that it was between them. I know. Just making sure. He paused. 2 hours. Get off your feet. He moved to his vehicle. Maya found a piece of flat rock in the partial shade of the valley wall, sat down with her back against stone and her rifle across her knees, and looked at the mountain. She didn't sleep. She rarely slept in the field. Not from anxiety. She'd long since made a separate peace with the persistent reality of danger, but because sleep in the field felt like a decision she made only when the alternative was genuine incapacitation. 30 minutes at a time, fully clothed, light enough that noise or movement brought her up completely. Combat medic habits. You learn to manage rest differently when rest meant someone might need you and you'd be the only one close enough to do anything about it. She sat and thought about the manpad systems. 36 already in distribution, 14 months of incidents that had been investigated and closed. The particular sophistication of a network that had thought far enough ahead to build a surveillance system that used a tactical element, her team, specifically, as route confirmation before moving cargo. She thought about what that level of planning required. The patience, the resources, the confidence that you could keep something this size quiet this long. She thought about the Kandahar facility fire, and the closed investigation, and the holding company structure 3 shells deep. And she thought about the name on the State Department clearance approval, which she had memorized because she memorized everything, and which she had not shared with the full team, only flagged to Torres and Cross, because there was a second layer to it that she hadn't said aloud yet. The name on the clearance approval appeared in her sector analysis. Not prominently, not in a way that had seemed significant at the time. A footnote in a logistics coordination report from 8 months ago, a signature on a movement authorization for a different convoy through a different valley. She'd noted it and filed it and moved on, because at the time it was one name among hundreds. Now it was the same name on 2 documents that were separated by 8 months and 2 provinces and one very specific pattern. She needed to pull the original report. She needed to pull it and compare the convoy details, and she needed to do it before the handoff package went to Bagram, because if the pattern was what she thought it was, the handoff package needed to include that second document, and whoever received it needed to understand they were looking at a repeat signature, not a single instance. She stood up. Her 2 hours weren't up. She walked to where Torres had set up his documentation station at the rear of the second vehicle and waited until he looked up from the detainee approach he was preparing. I need access to the Phobia Intelligence Archive, she said. Remote access through your terminal. He looked at her. Your rest window isn't up. I know. I need the archive. What are you looking for? A logistics coordination report from 8 months ago, Kandahar sector, I need to check a signature against the clearance document. Torres's eyes sharpened slightly. A repeat signature. Potentially. He turned his terminal toward her. Well, she found the report in 11 minutes. The signature was there. Same name, same department designation, same clearance level. The convoy it authorized had moved through the Arghandab Valley 8 months ago. 3 vehicles. Classified cargo manifest. Investigation of that convoy had not occurred because nothing had flagged it at the time. She read the manifest classification again. Equipment and materiel for Contractor Logistics Hub, Eastern Kandahar Province. The facility that burned down. The same facility where 36 manpad systems had been reported destroyed. This convoy had delivered cargo to that facility 3 weeks before the fire. She sat with that for a moment. Then she photographed the report with Torres's camera and attached it to the handoff package with a flag notation that was precise and careful and did not editorialize, because editorializing wasn't her job. Her job was to see things accurately and document them accurately and let the people whose job it was to draw conclusions draw the right ones from good material. She flagged it as potential recurrent authorization signature, cross-reference with clearance document attached. Second instance suggests pattern, not isolated action. Recommend investigation of all movement authorizations from this official over preceding 24-month period. She saved it. Then she went back to her rock and sat down and looked at the mountain and thought about the fact that whoever had approved this convoy's clearance had also, 8 months ago, approved the movement of cargo to a facility that subsequently burned down under circumstances that now look significantly less like an accident. She thought about what that meant for how deep this went. She was still thinking about it when Cross came and sat on a rock 4 feet away, which wasn't close enough to be companionable, but wasn't far enough to be separate. He sat for a while without speaking. She let him. Torres told me you found a second document, he said. Yes. The same signature. Yes. You flagged it to Torres before you flagged it to me. She heard the tone and understood it. Torres had access to the archive terminal. You were running security perimeter. You could have waited until I was available. The handoff package was being compiled. The window to include it was closing. She looked at him. I wasn't going around you, sir. I was working the timeline. He looked at the mountain. His jaw worked. I'm going to say something, and I don't want you to read it as an apology, he said, because I don't operate that way. She waited. My assessment of your role on this team was wrong. Has been wrong, not catastrophically wrong in the way that would have caused casualties. The team functioned, but wrong in the sense that I was underutilizing an asset because I hadn't looked at it properly. He turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were the specific flat gray of someone who was choosing words with deliberate precision. I'm adjusting that assessment. She looked at him. Noted, she said. That's all you've got. You said it wasn't an apology, so it doesn't require a response beyond acknowledgement. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the ghost of the idea of one, seen from a distance. You're difficult, he said. I've been told. By who? Everyone who met me before they decided I was useful. He looked at the mountain again. The second document. The repeat signature. You saw that in your sector analysis. I noted the name. The context wasn't significant at the time. But you remembered it. I remember everything in the analysis. Everything. Yes. He was quiet. How long did that analysis take you? 6 months. Most of it evenings and weekends. I don't sleep much. Why not? She considered whether to answer the actual question or the operational version of it. She decided on the actual question because Cross was in the process of recalibrating, and giving him accurate information served the recalibration. I was a combat medic before I went to sniper school, she said. In Helmand. I had a close friend in my unit. His name was Marcus Hale. He was killed by an insurgent sniper in an engagement where we had the tactical position to have prevented the shot if we'd had someone with the right training and the right eyes on the right terrain. I couldn't sleep after that, so I used the time. Cross looked at her. It was a different kind of look than any he'd directed at her previously. Not operational assessment, not recalibration, not the measuring look of someone deciding how much weight to assign her. Closer to the look that people gave when they recognized something from their own experience in someone else's. He didn't say anything about it. How long were you a medic, he said. 4 years. And then you decided to go for sniper qualification. I applied 4 times before they let me in the program. Why'd they keep turning you down? They saw a medic. They had a slot for a marksman. They kept looking for someone who fit the slot instead of looking at what I'd actually built. She paused. Eventually, someone looked at my qualification scores and my range records and let me in the program anyway. And you graduated. Top of my class. He sat with that. The afternoon light was going amber and flat. The angle that came before the mountain shadow swallowed everything at once. Top of your class, he said. Not a challenge, something else. By 11 points, she said, in case that was going to be the next question. He looked at her again. This time, the ghost of the idea of a smile was somewhat less ghostly. Get some actual rest before the extraction team arrives, he said. He stood. And Vance. She looked up. The sector analysis, the second document, the container modification. He seemed to be choosing the next words from a limited supply. Good work. He walked back toward the vehicles. She watched him go, then looked at the mountain, then at the rock under her hands. Gray stone, rough-edged, the kind of surface that held the day's heat longer than made sense and released it slowly into the cooling evening air. She sat with the words for a moment, not performing anything, not deciding what they meant for the team or the mission or her position, just sitting with them the way you sat with anything that took longer to arrive than it should have. Then she put them somewhere quiet and started thinking about the 36 man-pad systems still unaccounted for. Because the vehicles were stopped and the cargo was documented and the handoff package was on its way to Bagram, and that was good. That was the mission working the way missions were supposed to work. But 36 systems were somewhere in this sector in the hands of people who had been patient and sophisticated enough to build a 3-shell holding company and a fake NGO and a multi-element surveillance network and a false facility fire. Patient and sophisticated people with 36 shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles didn't stop. They waited. And the extraction helicopter was going to land in this valley in approximately 3 hours. She stood up. She went to Torres. The extraction flight, she said. What's the aircraft? Torres checked his comms log. Blackhawk. 2-ship element. Inbound from Bagram. What's their approach corridor? He told her. She looked at the terrain map on his terminal, looked at the approach corridor, looked at the elevation profile of the ridgelines on either side of it. She looked at the south ridgeline, the one she'd spent 4 hours on, and at the angle of the approach corridor relative to it. She looked for long enough that Torres followed her eyes to the map and then back to her face. What are you seeing? He said. She pointed at the corridor, at the ridgeline, at the specific terrain feature where the corridor came closest to elevated ground on the approach. If I had a man-pad system, she said carefully, and I wanted to use the approach of an extraction flight as an opportunity, and I had access to the same surveillance network that told these people we were in the valley, that told them the route was clear, then I'd know there was going to be an extraction flight, because they know we interdicted their convoy. They have eyes somewhere. Torres stared at the map. The approach corridor, he said, gets within 900 meters of the south ridgeline at this point. She touched the screen, which is within effective range of a man-pad system. Torres looked at her. Then he picked up his radio. Cross, he said, we have a problem with the extraction corridor. Across the staging area, Cross stopped walking. He turned, and the light was going and the mountain was going dark at the edges, and somewhere on a ridgeline that Maya Vance had spent the afternoon watching, something may or may not have been watching back. She picked up her rifle. She looked at the south ridge. She looked at it for a long time. Cross covered the distance to Torres's position in 12 seconds flat, which Maya knew because she counted without meaning to, the way she counted everything. He looked at the map. He looked at the approach corridor. He looked at the terrain feature she'd indicated, the point where the Blackhawks would come within 900 meters of the south ridgeline on their inbound leg. He looked at it for 4 seconds. Get Bagram on the line, Shah, he said. Now. Torres was already keying the long-range comms. Cross turned to Maya. Walk me through it. They had surveillance on this valley before the ambush, multi-element, coordinated, with comms discipline. That network didn't disappear when we interdicted the convoy. It just went quiet. Quiet isn't gone. She pointed at the south ridge without looking away from Cross. If they have eyes on this staging area right now, they know we stopped the shipment. They know there will be an extraction. They know the extraction is rotary wing because that's the only viable option in this terrain. She paused. And if any of those 36 systems are in this sector and positioned for use, the approach corridor gives the shooter on that ridge a 900-meter engagement window on a slow-moving helicopter at low altitude. That's a lot of ifs. The facility fire, the shell companies, the fake NGO, the frequency-hopping radios, the multi-element surveillance net, none of that is improvised. These people plan. She held his look. This isn't an if. This is what patient, resourced people do with shoulder-fired systems when an opportunity presents itself. Cross looked at the ridge. Torres, he said. Bagram online, sir. Cross took the handset. Kestrel, this is Cross. I need you to hold the extraction flight pending route assessment. We have a potential manpad threat on the approach corridor. He gave the coordinates, the grid, the terrain feature. I need an alternate approach planned that avoids the 900-meter window on the south ridge, or I need air assets to sweep the ridge before the Blackhawks come in. How copy? The response took 40 seconds, which was the length of time it took for the information to travel up one level and come back down with someone else's voice on it. Cross, this is Bagram Operations. We copy the threat assessment. Alternate approach is being plotted now. We're also tasking ISR. Scan Eagle is 20 minutes out. We'll have eyes on that ridgeline before the flight moves. Copy. Cross out. He handed the handset back to Torres and turned to the team. Security perimeter doubles. I want eyes on the south ridge from the valley floor. Anyone with a spotting scope or binos, use them. If there's movement on that ridge before the ISR gets overhead, I want to know about it. He looked at Maya. What's the best ground-level observation position for the south ridge from here? She'd already identified it. The rock formation at the north end of the staging area. 15 meters of elevation gain, clear sight line to the ridge face. Thermal shadows will be gone in about 20 minutes as the sun drops. If there's anybody up there, the angle changes enough to change the visibility profile of their position. You want to go back up? I want to observe from the formation, not the ridge. The formation gives me angle on the face without exposing me to counter-observation from above. If there's a shooter up there with optics, then they're looking at the valley floor in the staging area, not at a rock formation at the valley's edge. They're watching for the helicopters, not for me. Cross was quiet for 3 seconds. Harris goes with you, he said. She didn't argue. The rock formation was everything she'd described. A natural elevated platform at the valley's northern margin, enough height to change the observation angle without enough exposure to be visible from the ridgeline above. Maya was up it in 90 seconds. Harris took another 30, which wasn't slow for a man carrying his weight and kit. He didn't comment on the time difference. They settled in side by side, which was unusual enough that it registered. She'd spent most of the past 3 weeks operating in proximity to Harris without actually being next to him. He was larger than she'd realized up close. Not the exaggerated bulk of someone who'd built muscle for appearance, but the particular density of someone who had been doing hard physical work for so long that their body had adapted to it structurally. He got his binos up. She went to her scope. The south ridgeline swam into focus. Rock face, natural formations, shadow lines deepening as the sun moved. She worked the face systematically, left to right, top to bottom, looking not for the obvious things but for the wrong things. The shadow that moved when shadows weren't moving. The thermal irregularity. The shape that was almost natural. 18 minutes of nothing. Then, movement. Upper third of the ridge face, a natural shelf formation similar to the one she'd used for the observation post but higher, 40 meters higher, and offset to the east by 60 meters. A shape that was almost rock but wasn't rock because rock didn't adjust its position by 3 inches in response to the changing wind. Someone had been there for a while, long enough to know how to be still, not long enough to be fully invisible to someone who knew what to look for. 9 o'clock on the upper face, she said quietly. Natural shelf, left side. One person, prone, has been there long enough to be settled in but moved slightly about 30 seconds ago. Harris found it with his binos. Held. I see the position, he said. I can't confirm the person. Left edge of the shelf. The shadow line is wrong. It's interrupting the rock pattern. That's a human-shaped interruption. He held the binos steady, long enough that his arms should have started to feel it. Yeah, he said. Okay, yeah, I see it. One person, probably observer. If there's a shooter with a manpad, they're not that close to the observer. They'd be staged back from the ridge face to reduce their signature. She scanned right from the observer's position. 40 meters, 60, 80. There. Harris moved his binos right. Tucked into a natural cut in the rock, barely visible, was the distinctive angular profile of a launch tube. Even at this distance, even in the flattening late afternoon light, she knew the shape. She'd spent 6 months studying weapons profiles in photographs, in field reports, in manufacturer documentation that she'd requisitioned through channels that had looked at her request with mild confusion and processed it anyway. A launch tube. Shoulder-mounted, resting against the rock, oriented toward the northeast, toward the approach corridor. Torres, she said into her radio, keeping her voice exactly flat. South ridge, upper face. Observer at the shelf position I described across. Shooter position 80 meters east of the observer. Natural rock cut. I can see a launch tube. It is oriented toward the approach corridor. A pause. You're certain, Torres said. I'm certain about the tube. I'm certain about the orientation. I'm certain the ISR needs to see this before the Blackhawks move. Scan Eagle is 12 minutes out. The sun is going in approximately 25 minutes. Once the light drops to a specific threshold, I lose the visual on the tube because the shadow profile changes. 12 minutes is probably fine. Probably. Copy. Cross is on with Bagram now. Harris lowered his binos 2 inches and looked at her. Not the measuring look, not the categorizing look. The specific look of someone who has just updated a significant assumption and is deciding how to carry the new weight. You saw a launch tube at this distance, he said. Yes. In this light. The shape is distinctive. I've spent a long time looking at photographs of them. Photographs. And field reports. And manufacturer spec sheets. She didn't look away from her scope. You learn what things look like from enough angles and you recognize them even when the conditions aren't ideal. He was quiet. Harris, she said. Yeah. Keep your binos on the observer position. If they move before the ISR gets overhead, I need to know which direction. He brought the binos back up. Oh. The Scan Eagle arrived at 11 minutes, which was 1 minute better than promised and felt like considerably more. Maya tracked it by sound before she saw it. The specific low drone of a small, unmanned system riding the thermals above the ridge. The ISR feed went directly to Torres's terminal, and she could hear the crosstalk on the team channel as the imagery came through. Confirmation on the observer position, Torres reported. ISR confirms one individual prone with optics. Confirmation on the second position. ISR is calling it a high-confidence manpad sighting. Launch tube is present, oriented northeast, one operator in position. Cross's voice came through clipped and operational. Bagram, we have ISR confirmation on a 2-person manpad team, South Ridge, with the tube oriented on the approach corridor. I need the extraction flight held, and I need a fire mission on that position before any rotary wing comes within range. The response from Bagram was faster this time. Someone had already been thinking about options. Cross, we have a problem with the fire mission. The ridge position is 200 meters from a village on the south side. Rules of engagement don't support indirect fire at that proximity without a positive ID on a hostile act in progress. The tube is present and oriented, but they haven't fired. They're staged and waiting. I know what they're staged to do, Cross. The rules say hostile act in progress. Cross's voice went very quiet, which was worse than loud. If I wait for a hostile act in progress, one of my Blackhawks is down. I understand that. We're working options. Stand by. Stand by. Maya had been listening to this exchange while keeping her scope on the ridge. The observer hadn't moved. The shooter's position was static. The tube was oriented. They were waiting for the helicopters. Waiting with the patience of people who had done this kind of waiting before, who understood that the right moment was worth the discomfort of holding still. She calculated the distance from her current position to the shooter's position. 1,400 meters. The target was behind a rock cut, which meant she had partial exposure on the shooter at best. And a launch tube without a full-body target was a complicated engagement even under ideal conditions. The observer was different. The observer was prone on an open shelf. The observer was the communication link between the team and whoever else was watching. If the observer reported the ISR drone, they'd know the position was compromised and potentially abort, which would be the best outcome. If abort meant they disappeared with the tube and didn't simply relocate. If they relocated, she'd lose them. Cross came back on the channel. All elements. Bagram is working a KAS option, a fast mover to overfly the ridge and give the shooter team a chance to stand down before the extraction flight moves. They think a supersonic overpass at low altitude might convince them to break contact. A pause. I think it's optimistic, but it buys us time while we work the alternate approach. Harris lowered his binos. A fast mover overpass. On a trained manpad team. He said it to no one specifically. Maya said nothing. Vance. Cross-direct. From your current position, the shooter's position, what do you have? She ran it again. She'd been running it for the past 6 minutes, which meant she'd run it approximately 8 times. The answer kept coming back the same. Partial exposure on the shooter. The rock cut gives them cover from the front and right. I'm offset to the left of their orientation, which gives me a better angle than a direct approach would, but the cover is still significant. I have a potential window on the left side of the position. The tube is extending past the rock face on that side by approximately 2 feet. If the shooter moves forward to acquire a target, they'll have to bring their left shoulder out from behind the cut. If they move to acquire. At the moment of acquisition, yes, for approximately the window it takes to acquire and fire. How long is that window? 4 to 6 seconds from the moment they break cover to the moment they fire, variable depending on the operator's experience. Can you make the shot in that window? She looked at the position, at the angle, at the 1,400 meters of mountain air between her and a partially exposed target that would be moving at the moment of engagement in declining light, with a wind that had been inconsistent all afternoon and would only get more inconsistent as the temperature differential between the valley floor and the ridge face widened with the dropping sun. She thought about the Blackhawks. She thought about 4 men in a CH-47 over Salerno 14 months ago, classified as mechanical failure, investigation closed. Yes, she said. Silence on the channel. Then Cross, very carefully. That's not an order. I'm asking you a capability question. I understand. Bagram is working the CAS option. The alternate approach route is being plotted. We may not need to engage. I understand that too. But if we reach the point where the flight is inbound and the position is still active and the CAS option has not resolved it, then you'll need to make a decision quickly, she said. And I'm telling you that the capability exists if you make that decision. Another silence. Longer this time. Harris was looking at her. She kept her eye to the scope. The KAS option fell apart 18 minutes later. The fast mover overpass had been approved and was inbound when the observer on the South Ridge, who had apparently been in communication with someone Maya couldn't see, broke position, not a retreat, a repositioning. The observer moved 40 meters east along the shelf, which put them behind a secondary rock formation and out of the ISR's direct line of sight. ISR is reporting the observer has moved to a defilade position, Torres said. They've gone to ground behind the secondary formation. The scan eagle can't maintain visual. They know the ISR is up, Cross said. Yes, sir. Which means the fast mover overpass isn't going to convince them of anything. They're already in cover. A pause. What's the shooter doing? Shooter hasn't moved, still in the cut, tube still oriented. The observer had moved to cover. The shooter had stayed, which meant the observer had made a calculation. Cover yourself, leave the shooter in position, because the shot matters more than the observer's exposure. They were committed. Maya registered all of this while keeping her scope exactly where it had been. The shooter's position, the left side of the rock cut. The 2 feet of launch tube extending past the cover. Cross, Bagram's voice on the long-range channel. The alternate approach route is going to add 11 minutes to the extraction flight's inbound leg. Total revised flight time is 43 minutes from wheels up. The route still comes within 1,200 meters of the ridge at its closest point. We couldn't fully avoid it without adding time we don't have. The flight has enough fuel for the revised route, but not for a significant hold at the LZ. So the alternate route still has a window. A reduced window, 1,200 versus 900 meters. Still within manpad range. Yes, sir. Cross said nothing for 4 seconds. The sun was 12 minutes from the point where Maya would lose the visual profile of the tube. She held her position. Her breathing was slow and entirely controlled. She had put herself in the particular interior space that she'd found. Not built, found, the way you found a room in a house you'd lived in for years without noticing it, during her 2nd year of training. A space where the external world continued at full resolution but stopped requiring management. where calculation happened without effort because effort implied resistance, and she wasn't resisting anything. She was just present with what was there. 1,400 meters. Partial exposure, 4 to 6 second window. Variable wind currently reading at 9 knots, right to left, with a gust pattern she'd been tracking for 22 minutes. The pattern wasn't regular, but it had a rhythm. Not clockwork, but shaped. She knew the shape well enough now to anticipate the next trough. Cross, she said. Not loud, not urgent. The tone she used when she had something precise to say and needed it heard exactly as she said it. The sun gives me approximately 10 minutes of viable visual on that position. After that, I lose the exposure angle on the tube. If the extraction flight is not in and out before dark, and if that position is still active, the threat doesn't go away. It just becomes impossible to observe from the ground. She paused. I'm giving you a timeline, not a recommendation. Understood. Cross's voice was the voice of a man standing at the exact center of a decision he'd be living with regardless of which way it went. What's your confidence on the shot? High on the tube, variable on the operator. If the operator stays behind cover and fires from the cut without coming forward, the engagement is low confidence. If they come forward to acquire, you said 4 to 6 seconds. Yes. You've made shots in shorter windows. She had. She hadn't told him that. She hadn't told anyone that. The range records from her training documented the times, not the subjective experience of making them, and she'd learned not to translate range records into conversation because it sounded like performance, and she had no interest in performing. Yes, she said. Harris, beside her, was completely still. She could feel the quality of his stillness. It wasn't passive. It was the stillness of someone who was present with something and not moving because moving would interrupt it. Cross came back. Bagram, I need a decision. Either you clear me to engage the MANPAD team, or you reroute the extraction flight to an entirely different LZ, which means the cargo and detainees stay on the valley floor overnight without adequate security. Those are the options. Bagram was quiet for 8 seconds. Cross, the ROE requires. I know what the ROE requires. I'm telling you what the tactical situation requires. A trained, staged MANPAD team with a tube oriented on any approach corridor to this LZ is a hostile act in preparation. My team has confirmed the tube, confirmed the orientation, confirmed the positioning. I'm asking for authorization to engage before a hostile act in progress becomes a Black Hawk on a mountainside. 10 seconds of silence. 15. Cross. A different voice. Older. The same voice that had asked Maya about the container modification. Hayes. I'm listening. Sir, I have a sniper with eyes on the position and a confirmed engagement capability. The window is approximately 8 minutes. After that, the light degrades below viable engagement threshold and we lose our only ground-based option. Your sniper's capability assessment. High confidence on the shot if the operator moves to acquire. And if they don't move, then the extraction flight takes a modified approach and we hope 1,200 meters is enough. Sir. Hayes was quiet for 5 seconds. Cross. You're authorized to engage at your discretion if the shooter moves to acquire. Do not fire preemptively. Wait for the hostile act. Copy. Cross switch channels. Vance. Sir. You heard? Yes. The extraction flight is going to begin its inbound leg in 4 minutes on the modified approach. When they hit the 1,200 meter window, if that shooter comes forward to acquire, you take the shot. Copy. If they don't come forward, then the shot doesn't happen. Right. She heard him breathing once on the channel, the specific breath of someone setting something down. Vance. His voice dropped into a register that wasn't command tone. It was quieter than that. I'm asking you because you're the one capable of making this shot, not because I want to put it on you. I know why you're asking, sir. She kept her eye to the scope. That's why I said yes. The channel went quiet. 8 minutes, maybe 7 now. She held. Check. The extraction flight checked in at 3 minutes out. 2 Blackhawks, modified approach, the crew aware of the threat assessment, and flying the route the way crews flew routes with active threat assessments. Lower than comfortable, faster than preferred on the inbound leg, prepared to abort if anything came off that ridgeline. Maya heard the rotors before she could see the aircraft. The specific sound of rotor wash bouncing off mountain terrain, directional and deceptive, seeming to come from 3 places simultaneously. She filed the sound and kept her scope where it had been for the past 31 minutes. The shooter hadn't moved. The tube hadn't moved. The observer was still behind the secondary formation. Still. 2 minutes out. The wind trough she'd been tracking came and went, and she recalculated. The next one was approximately 45 seconds away based on the pattern. After that, another 40 to 50 seconds. The timing mattered because if the shooter moved to acquire during a gust, the drift calculation changed significantly, and she'd need to adjust in real time. She hoped the shooter moved during a trough, 1 minute out. She could see the Blackhawks now, low and fast, dark shapes against the pale last light of the western sky, coming in from the northeast on the modified corridor. The shooter moved. Not dramatically. Not in a way that someone watching casually would have registered as significant. A shift of weight, a change in the angle of the body, the left shoulder coming forward 2 inches from behind the rock cut as the operator repositioned to acquire. The launch tube rotated. Moving, Maya said. One word, flat, for Harris's awareness. She was already adjusting. The shoulder had moved her aiming point. She'd been holding on the left edge of the cut, and the operator's position shift put the target plane approximately 6 inches forward of where she'd been holding. She adjusted in real time. The wind was between gusts. The trough she'd predicted. She had the window, 4 seconds, maybe 5. She put the crosshair where it needed to be and fired. The rifle cracked. The round traveled 1,400 meters in approximately 1.6 seconds. It hit. The launch tube dropped. The operator dropped with it, backward, into the cut. The tube did not fire. The Blackhawks crossed the 1,200-meter threshold and continued their approach. The valley went quiet except for the rotors. Harris said nothing for 4 seconds. Then, that was 1,400 meters. Yes. Moving target, partial exposure. Yes. In that light. Yes. She began breaking down her position. Methodical. Same as always. The rifle came apart in the order it came apart, and she packed it in the order she packed it, and her hands were steady because she had been in this space before, and she knew how to come back out of it without leaving pieces of herself at the bottom. The Blackhawks were on the deck. She could hear the pitch change as they flared for landing. Torres's voice came through the channel. Observer has broken contact. ISR is tracking them north along the ridge. They're moving fast. No hostile action. Copy, Cross said. Let them go. The threat is neutralized. Neutralized. That was the word they used. She understood why. It was precise and operational, and it didn't carry weight that wasn't hers to carry, not professionally. She finished packing her kit. Harris was still on position, binos up, watching the ridge. He put them down when she shouldered her rifle and stood. He looked at her. The expression was the one that had been coming and going for the past 3 weeks, the one she didn't have a category for. It had been consolidating all evening, through the observation post and the tube identification and the last 45 minutes on this rock, and now it had settled into something she could finally read. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't admiration exactly. It was closer to the expression of someone who had been arguing a position for a long time and had finally, quietly, in the middle of an argument, run out of reasons to keep arguing it. He didn't say anything. She nodded once. They climbed down. The cargo transfer took 40 minutes. The detainees went on the second bird with a 2-man security element. The weapons crates went on the first, strapped and documented and accounted for. 12 systems that were no longer going wherever 12 man-pad systems were supposed to go. Maya was loading her kit onto the second bird when Cross came up beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. They stood in the rotor wash, the noise making conversation difficult, which was maybe why he'd chosen the moment. Hayes is requesting a full debrief when we get back, he said, close enough that she could hear him. He wants you in the room. She looked at him. He specifically said your name, Cross said. Not my team. Your name. She processed that. The sector analysis, she said. Probably. And the container modification, and the approach corridor, and the shot. He paused. He's going to have questions. I can answer questions. I know you can. He said it without the qualifier that used to live in the gap before statements like that. The qualifier was gone. I'll be in the room. She didn't ask why. She understood why. He was saying something without the words for it. The same way he'd been communicating for 3 weeks, except the content had changed completely. She nodded. He moved toward the first bird. She finished loading and climbed into the second, settling against the airframe with her rifle between her knees and the valley dropping away beneath the helicopter's climb, the south ridge passing below in the last gray light, the rock cut where the shooter had been. Now empty, equipment gone with the observer who'd broken contact, nothing left that you'd notice from the air if you didn't know what you were looking at. She looked at it until it disappeared behind the ridgeline. Harris was across from her, helmet on, eyes forward. He glanced at her once. She looked at the valley floor one more time, at the stopped convoy, at the evidence markers, at the dust that the rotors had raised, and that was still settling. Then she looked at the dark coming in from the east and let the noise of the aircraft fill the space where thought would otherwise have been, and she sat with the specific quality of exhaustion that wasn't tiredness, wasn't physical, wasn't emotional, was something in between that only came after hours of sustained precision under pressure, when the precision was no longer required and the body was still deciding it could stand down. She sat with it. She let it be what it was. Outside, the mountain fell away and the sky went dark above the Hindu Kush, and the two Blackhawks flew north toward FOB Kestrel, carrying everything that the valley had given up: the cargo, the detainees, the documentation, the intelligence thread that was going to pull on things nobody was going to enjoy having pulled. And one woman who had spent 6 months preparing for a deployment she wasn't supposed to be part of, sitting in the red-lit interior of a helicopter, looking at nothing in particular. Thinking about the 36 systems still out there, thinking about the name on the clearance document, thinking about the debrief that Hayes had requested, and what questions it would contain, and what answers those questions would require, and whether the people in the room would be ready to hear them. She thought about Marcus Hale. She thought about him briefly and specifically, and without the full weight of it, the way she'd learned to think about him: present, acknowledged, then set aside, because carrying it fully wasn't an option in the field, and she was still, technically, in the field until the wheels touched down at Kestrel. The helicopter banked north. She closed her eyes. Not sleeping. Never quite sleeping. Just giving the calculation somewhere quiet to run. FOB Kestrel was lit the way forward operating bases were always lit at night. Functional. Harsh. The kind of fluorescent and floodlighting that existed to serve purpose rather than comfort, turning everyone's face the same flat gray regardless of rank or exhaustion level. The helicopters touched down at 2117 local, and by 2130 the cargo was being transferred to a secured holding facility and the detainees were being processed, and Maya was sitting in a plastic chair outside a briefing room she hadn't been invited into yet, her kit at her feet, her rifle between her knees, waiting. She was good at waiting. The chair was the uncomfortable kind, the molded plastic variety that existed in every military installation she'd ever been on. And she'd been on enough to know that the discomfort was probably not intentional, but had never been corrected because nobody with the authority to correct it spent enough time sitting in one to remember it was a problem. She shifted once, found no improvement, and stayed still. Through the wall she could hear voices. Crosses, lower and more measured. Another voice she didn't know. Then Hayes, recognizable even through drywall by the clipped authority of a man who had been making significant decisions long enough that significance no longer changed his register. Torres came and sat in the chair beside her at 2143. He had coffee in 2 cups, handed her one without asking, and sat back with his own. "They're going through the handoff package," he said. "I know. Hayes has been in there since we landed." "I know." He drank his coffee. She drank hers. It was bad coffee. The specific badness of coffee that had been on a burner too long and had gone slightly bitter and slightly metallic. And she drank it anyway because caffeine was caffeine, and she'd been awake for 19 hours. "The sector analysis," Torres said. "Hayes asked me about it before you landed, specifically about how it was structured and what sources you used." "What did you tell him?" "That it was the most comprehensive sector analysis I'd seen produced by a single individual at your grade." He paused. He didn't say anything, but he wrote something down. She looked at the briefing room door. Torres. The name on the clearance document, the repeat signature. When you included it in the handoff package, how did you characterize it? Exactly as you flagged it. Potential recurrent authorization signature, 2 instances. Recommend investigation of all movement authorizations over a 24-month period. He turned his cup in his hands. Why? Because whoever receives that package is going to have to decide what to do with it. And what they decide will tell us something about whether the problem goes deeper than one name on two documents. Torres was quiet for a moment. You think it does, he said. I think a shell company 3 layers deep, a facility fire that conveniently destroyed the evidence of a theft, and a State Department clearance that moved cargo to that same facility 3 weeks before the fire. That's not one person working alone. That's a structure. Structures require multiple people. Which means the investigation could go places that make people uncomfortable. Yes. Which means there will be pressure to contain it. Yes. He drank his coffee. Well, he said, that's a cheerful thought. The briefing room door opened at 22:01. A staff officer Maya didn't recognize leaned out and looked at her. Sergeant Vance, Colonel Hayes will see you now. The room was larger than the debrief space at the Kalat, but had the same essential quality. Functional, paper-covered surfaces. A map display running on one wall. Too many chairs around a table that was slightly too small for the number of people who needed to use it. Hayes was at the head. Cross was to his right. 2 men Maya didn't know sat on the left side. One in uniform with intelligence branch insignia, one in civilian clothes that were trying and failing to look casual. The civilian's shoes were wrong for the field. Clean soles. Someone who had flown in. She sat where the staff officer indicated, which was across from Cross, which put her directly in Hayes's eye line. Hayes looked at her the way he probably looked at everything, with the specific attention of a man who had learned that the details people didn't think he'd notice were usually the most important ones. He was older than she'd pictured from his voice. Late 50s, hair gone almost entirely gray, a face that had been outdoors in hard conditions long enough to have that particular weathered quality that wasn't aging so much as accumulation. Sergeant Vance, he said, before we get into the substance, how long have you been awake? She hadn't expected that to be the first question. Approximately 19 hours, sir. When did you last eat? Mid-afternoon, the water point at the staging area. He looked at the staff officer by the door. Get her something from the DFAC, whatever's available. Back to Maya. We'll start while you eat. I'm not interested in interviewing someone whose blood sugar is in the basement. She didn't say anything. The staff officer left. The sector analysis, Hayes said. Sergeant Torres characterized it as comprehensive. Walk me through how you built it. 6 months of source aggregation and cross-referencing, she said. Intelligence reports, after-action reviews, signals traffic summaries, logistics documentation, terrain analysis, pattern of life assessments for the valley systems in this sector. I built a working model of the operational environment and updated it as new reporting came in. 6 months. Yes, sir. On your own time. Yes, sir. Without authorization. She looked at him. Without specific authorization, yes. There's no regulation prohibiting an attached specialist from conducting independent research on their operational sector. The civilian on the left made a small movement. Not quite a shift, not quite a reaction. The kind of micro-adjustment that happened when someone heard something that landed somewhere they hadn't expected. No, Hayes said. There isn't. He opened the folder in front of him. The repeat signature, the name appearing on both the Kandahar Logistics Authorization and the NGO clearance. You identified that connection in the field, under time pressure, from memory. I identified it when Torres gave me access to the archive. I recognized the name from the sector analysis. The connection wasn't something I'd built into the analysis. It was pattern recognition in the moment. From a name you'd seen once, 8 months ago, in a footnote. Yes, sir. Hayes looked at her for a moment. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I'd like a direct answer, he said. Yes, sir. How many people in this command do you think are capable of what you did in the last 48 hours? The terrain analysis, the container modification ID, the approach corridor assessment, the manpad engagement, all of it, not individually. She looked at him. It was the kind of question that had a wrong way to answer and a right way, and the wrong way was false modesty, and the right way was honesty. And honesty in this room, with this man, was what the question was actually testing. I don't know, sir. I don't have visibility on the full personnel pool. Guess. I'm not in the habit of guessing. Something moved at the corner of Hayes's mouth. Not the ghost of a smile, the actual thing, brief and contained. Fair. Let me rephrase. Do you believe that what you did in the last 48 hours represents standard performance for a sniper attached to a Tier 2 element? No, sir. What does it represent? Preparation, she said, and the willingness to use it when the situation required it. The civilian on the left leaned forward slightly. Sergeant Vance, I'm going to introduce myself. He had the measured voice of someone who chose his words the way a watchmaker chose components, for precision, not aesthetics. My name is Carver. I'm with the Defense Intelligence Agency. I've been working the supply network thread for the past 7 months. She waited. The name on the clearance document, Carver said. The repeat signature. We've been aware of it for approximately 3 months. We've been building a case. He paused. Your addition to the handoff package, the second document, the cross-reference, filled in a gap we hadn't been able to close. The Kandahar Logistics Authorization puts the subject in direct contact with the facility before the fire. That's the link we needed. She processed that. 3 months, she said. You've been building a case for 3 months? Yes. And in 3 months you didn't find the Kandahar authorization. We found it. We couldn't connect it to the network definitively because we didn't have the facility link. The subject's name appeared in dozens of logistics authorizations during that period. Without the facility connection, it was noise in a very large signal. I found the connection in 11 minutes using a standard archive terminal. Carver looked at her without expression. Yes, you did. The staff officer came back with a plate, rice, something that had been chicken earlier in the day, and 2 bread rolls, and set it in front of her. She ate without ceremony, fork in her left hand, eyes on the room. Hayes waited until she'd gotten through half of it before continuing, which she noted and filed. The investigation, Hayes said, where it goes from here. I want your assessment of the risk of containment pressure. She set the fork down. Sir, I'm a sergeant. That's a question for, I know what rank you are, Vance. I'm asking you because you've demonstrated better situational awareness in the last 48 hours than people of considerably higher rank, and because the question is relevant to your continued involvement in this operation, which I'm considering. He looked at her steadily. So give me your assessment. She looked at Cross. He was watching her with the expression she'd catalogued on the helicopter, the one that meant he was present and paying attention and had stopped filtering her through the previous assumption set. The network is sophisticated enough to have survived for at least 14 months while moving significant material through a region with substantial intelligence coverage, she said. That level of operational security requires either exceptional tradecraft or penetration of the intelligence apparatus monitoring it, or both. If there's penetration at the monitoring layer, then the handoff package has potentially been seen by people who are part of the network. She paused. The containment pressure wouldn't come from people trying to protect themselves politically. It would come from people trying to protect an active operation. The room was quiet. That's a significant allegation, the uniformed intelligence officer said. He was the first time he'd spoken. His voice had the tone of someone who found the conversation uncomfortable and was using precision as a management tool. I'm not making an allegation, Maya said. You asked for a risk assessment. That's the risk. Based on what evidence? Based on the fact that a multi-element surveillance network with frequency-hopping radio protocols and a 3-shell holding company and a fake facility fire managed to operate for 14 months in a sector with active intelligence coverage. Either the tradecraft was exceptional enough that no monitoring system flagged it, or something was suppressing the flags. She looked at him. I'm not in a position to determine which, but the risk that it's the latter is non-zero, and treating the handoff package as fully secure without assessing that risk seems like an oversight. The intelligence officer looked at Carver. Carver looked at Hayes. Hayes looked at Maya. The 36 systems, Hayes said, your assessment of their current status. Staged for use. The network didn't build this distribution structure to hold the systems. They built it to move them to end users. The 12 we interdicted tonight were in transit, which means the 36 that moved earlier are already at their destinations. She picked up the fork again because the food was getting cold, and she was still hungry, and nobody in the room looked like they were going to object. The Manpad team on the South Ridge tonight was a reactive deployment. They had the system available, and they used it when the opportunity presented. That suggests the systems are accessible and operational, not in deep storage. Threat timeline. Short. If the network knows the convoy was interdicted, and they do, the observer broke contact with enough time to report before we could stop them. Then whoever is running this is aware that the supply chain is compromised, and will either accelerate use of the systems in place or attempt to relocate them before the investigation tightens. She paused. Acceleration is more likely. Relocation requires movement, and movement creates exposure. A patient network that's been running for 14 months will understand that moving the systems now, when the investigation is active, is higher risk than using them on a timeline they accelerate. Hayes wrote something down. Cross was still watching her. He hadn't spoken since she'd entered the room. She understood why. He was there as the operational commander of record, not as a voice in the debrief. But his presence wasn't passive. He was there because Hayes had wanted him there, and Hayes had wanted him there because Hayes was making decisions that involved Cross's team. "Sergeant Vance," Hayes said, "I'm going to ask you something that's outside the standard framework of this debrief, and you are not obligated to answer." "Yes, sir." "Your background." "Combat medic, 4 years, Helmand Province. 4 rejected applications to sniper school before acceptance. Graduated first in your qualification class. Independent sector analysis prepared over 6 months on personal time. The container modification identification. The approach corridor threat assessment. The 1,400-meter engagement tonight." He looked at her. "That's not a career trajectory. That's a project. What are you building?" She looked at him steadily. "I'm trying to make sure I'm never in the position I was in again," she said. "Helmand." "Yes, sir." "The friend you lost." She'd told Cross that on the valley floor. Cross was in this room. She wasn't surprised Hayes knew. "Yes." "You've been building toward something specific since then." "I've been building toward being useful," she said. "Specifically useful in the ways that matter, the ways that change outcomes." She paused. "Marcus died because the team didn't have the right capability in the right position. I decided to become that capability." The room was quiet for long enough that the ventilation system became audible. "That's not nothing," Hayes said. Not softly. It wasn't a soft statement. It was the specific acknowledgement of a man who dealt in outcomes and was recognizing one. The uniformed intelligence officer, she still didn't know his name, shifted in his chair. "Colonel, with respect, this debrief is developing into something beyond its original scope. The sergeant's background is relevant to the operational record, but the investigation questions are mine to manage, Forsyth." Hayes didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The sergeant identified the threat pattern, built the intelligence thread, made the engagement, and added the critical document to the handoff package. She's earned the conversation. Forsyth went quiet. Hayes looked at Maya. "The sector analysis. Is it documented?" "Full written analysis in a binder in my kit, sir. Digital copy on an encrypted drive." She paused. "Also partially in my head, but that's less portable." Something shifted in Carver's expression, the first fully readable expression she'd seen from him. Not warmth, but interest. The specific interest of someone who had just identified a resource. "We're going to need that analysis," Carver said. "Both copies. The investigation team will want to run it against our existing data." "I'll need it back." "You'll get copies." "I'll need the original back," she said, "because I'm still updating it." Cross made a sound that might have been the leading edge of a laugh, suppressed before it fully formed. Carver looked at Hayes. Hayes looked at Maya. "You're still updating it," Hayes said. "I've added 3 items since we landed. There are 2 threads in the intelligence we collected today that I haven't fully traced yet. The radio encryption variant has an origin point I want to confirm. And the observer's repositioning pattern before the ISR arrived suggests familiarity with the Scan Eagle's operating parameters, which means either they've operated against ISR before in this sector, or they've been briefed on its capabilities by someone who has." The last sentence landed the way she'd intended it to, precisely and without dramatization, which was its own kind of weight. Forsyth looked at Carver. Carver looked at his hands. Hayes looked at the middle distance. "The Scan Eagle's operating parameters," Hayes said, "are not widely disseminated. The observer moved to exactly the right position to break ISR visual coverage within 90 seconds of the platform going active. Either that was exceptional intuitive tradecraft, or they had prior knowledge of the coverage profile." She met Hayes's eyes. "I'm not asserting which. I'm flagging it as something the investigation should assess." "Duly flagged." Hayes closed his folder. He looked around the room, at Carver, at Forsyth, at Cross, and the look had the quality of a decision being communicated without words. "I want the full sector analysis tomorrow morning. Carver, your team integrates it with the existing case file. Forsyth, the handoff package goes to a restricted distribution list. I'll sign off on each name personally. He looked back at Maya. Sergeant Vance, your attachment to Cross's element, what's the original end date? 12 days, sir. I'm extending it, indefinitely, pending the investigation timeline. He held up a hand before she could respond, though she hadn't been going to respond, or at least not in the way he was anticipating. That's not a request. I understand, sir. I wasn't going to object. Most people in your position would want to know what indefinitely means for their career track. Most people in my position haven't been trying to get exactly here for the past 3 years, she said. Sir. Hayes studied her for a moment. Dismissed, he said. Get some sleep. She stood, gathered the plate, the food was gone, and set it on the edge of the table for the staff officer. Picked up her kit. At the door, Hayes' voice. Vance. She stopped. 1,400 meters. Moving target. Partial exposure. In that light. He said it the way Harris had said it, not as a compliment, but as a statement of fact being verified. Were you certain? She thought about the honest answer, the space she'd found inside the shot, the wind pattern she had spent 22 minutes learning, the geometry she'd run 8 times. I was as certain as the conditions allowed, she said, which was certain enough. He nodded once. She left. The hallway outside was empty and fluorescent and slightly too cold, the way FOB interiors ran the air conditioning as if aggressively compensating for the heat outside. She stood in it for a moment, kit over one shoulder, rifle in hand, processing the debrief the way she processed everything. Not emotionally, not immediately, but in the systematic way of someone who stored things properly rather than just stacking them. Cross came out 40 seconds later. He stopped when he saw her still in the hallway. A flicker of something crossed his face. Not surprise, exactly. Expectation recalibrated. I thought you'd be halfway to the bunkhouse, he said. I wanted to know what happened after I left. He looked at her. Hayes is extending the investigation. Carver's team takes the lead on the network thread. Forsyth is going to fight the restricted distribution for about 48 hours, and then he's going to lose. He paused. Your name is going on the operational record as primary intelligence contributor for the convoy interdiction. She processed that. And the shot. Confirmed engagement, manpad threat neutralized, extraction flight secured. It'll be in the report. That's not what I'm asking. He knew it wasn't. He looked at the wall briefly, then back at her. Hayes is recommending a commendation. He'll fight for more when the investigation closes and the full scope is documented. He paused. That's not why you're asking either. No. You want to know if the shot changes how this team operates. I want to know if I'm still the support attachment. He was quiet for 3 seconds. The specific 3 seconds of a man who had already made a decision and was choosing how to deliver it. No, he said. You're not. She looked at him. What you are, he said, is the person I should have been using correctly since day one. Which is on me, not you, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. He shifted his weight. The debrief in there. Hayes asked me point blank when I first assessed your capability, and I told him the truth, that I assessed you as a support asset because of your assignment designation, and I didn't look past the designation until you made me. He looked at her steadily. I made an error in professional judgment. I've corrected it. I'll be making a formal correction in the record. She held his gaze. Cross. Yeah. I appreciate that. I do. She paused. But I need to ask you something. Ask? If you'd known from day one, the sector analysis, the capability, all of it, would it have been different? He thought about it honestly, which was the only way the question could be answered. Probably not on day one, he said. Probably by day 3. He paused. The way this team operates, the assumptions that were in the room before you walked in, those take time to move, even with perfect information. He looked at her. I'm telling you that not as an excuse, as an acknowledgement of what you were dealing with. She nodded. Yeah, she said. I know. They stood in the hallway for a moment with that between them. Not comfortable, not uncomfortable. The specific quality of 2 people who had arrived somewhere real after a long approach. Get some sleep, Vance. You said that inside. It was good advice inside. It's still good advice. She almost smiled. Almost. She turned and walked toward the bunkhouse. The bunkhouse was 4 plywood walls and 8 cots and a single light that someone had taped a red lens over for the benefit of people trying to sleep while others moved. 3 cots were occupied. She could tell by the breathing patterns, even and deep, the sleep of people who had learned to go down fast and completely. She found the empty cot that had been assigned to her and sat on the edge of it and began unlacing her boots in the dark. Harris's voice, from 2 cots over, quiet and slightly rough with the edges of sleep. How was the debrief? She hadn't known he was awake. Long, she said. Hayes treat you right. Professional. A pause. Carver was there. You know him. Him. Know of him. He's been running the network thread for months. Good analyst. Careful. Another pause. He say anything about the repeat signature? They've known about it for 3 months. They needed the facility link. Harris was quiet. Which you found in 11 minutes. Which I found in 11 minutes. He exhaled. Not a sigh. More the specific sound of someone setting down something they'd been holding for a while. The shot tonight, he said. She waited. I've been doing this job for 9 years, Harris said. I've worked with 3 dedicated snipers and 2 attached marksmen. I've seen some good shooting. He paused. That shot was something I'm going to tell people about in 10 years, and they're not going to believe me. She kept unlacing her boot. They'll believe you, she said. How do you figure? Because Torres documented everything, the range, the conditions, the target profile. It'll be in the record. He made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she'd heard from him. Always the practical answer. Usually the right answer. Silence. Then Vance. Yeah. The day you got attached, when Cross introduced you to the team and I did the thing with the spacing. He paused. You know what I mean. I know what you mean. That was... He stopped. Started again. I'm not going to pretend it was something other than what it was. Okay. Okay, he repeated. That's it? Okay? What do you want me to say, Harris? I don't know. Something. She thought about it. The boot came off. She set it on the floor, methodical, quiet. You saw what you expected to see, she said. You adjusted when the evidence changed. That's more than a lot of people manage. She started on the second boot. That's enough. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he'd gone back to sleep. Get some rest, he said finally. Hayes is going to run you hard tomorrow. Probably. You ready for that? She set the second boot down. I've been ready, she said, for a while now. The light behind the red lens hummed. Outside, the phobie made its nighttime sounds. Generators, distant vehicle movement, the occasional burst of radio traffic from the operations center that never fully went quiet. She lay back on the cot without undressing beyond the boots, rifle beside her on the floor within arm's reach, and looked at the plywood ceiling. She thought about the 36 systems. She thought about the observer on the ridge breaking contact, moving north, carrying whatever they knew back to whoever needed to know it. She thought about the name on the clearance document and what an investigation into 24 months of authorizations was going to find, and whether the people who needed to find it were the right people or the wrong ones. She thought about Hayes asking her what she was building. She hadn't given him the full answer. Not because she'd withheld it deliberately. It was more that the full answer was larger than the question had space for. She wasn't building toward a rank or a role or a recognition. She was building toward the moment when the thing she'd become would be sufficient, when the preparation would meet the situation and the situation would resolve differently than it had on a road in Helmand with Marcus Hale bleeding out in her hands and a sniper she hadn't seen in time on a ridge she hadn't thought to look at carefully enough. She couldn't go back and look at that ridge. But she could look at every other one. She closed her eyes. The generators hummed. She was asleep in 4 minutes, which was fast for her, which meant the body had finally decided the threat assessment could rest. Her hand stayed near the rifle. Even in sleep, she kept the things that mattered close. She woke at 05:12 without an alarm, which was how she always woke. Not gradually, not with the slow surfacing of someone pulled from deep water, but completely, all at once, the way a switch moved from off to on. The bunkhouse was still dark behind the red lens. The breathing patterns of the other cots had shifted. Harris was gone, one other cot empty. The generators outside had changed pitch slightly, which meant the morning shift at the operations center had cycled over and changed the load balance. She lay still for 40 seconds, running the prior day through the part of her mind that processed things during sleep and left the results waiting. The 36 systems. The observer moving north. The name on the clearance document. Carver's 3-month investigation and the gap she'd closed in 11 minutes. Hayes's question about what she was building. She got up, laced her boots, picked up the rifle. The sector analysis binder was in her kit. Zach's kit, exactly where she'd put it. She pulled it out, sat on the edge of the cot in the red-lit dark, and opened it to the section she'd been thinking about since the helicopter ride back. The radio encryption thread. The ISR coverage profile. The 2 items she hadn't fully traced. She worked for an hour before the rest of the bunkhouse came fully awake. Carver found her in the operations center at 0700, which meant he'd been looking. She was at a terminal with Torres's access credentials. Torres had given them freely, which said something about how the dynamic had shifted. Running a comparison between the frequency hopping protocol from the recovered radio and signal traffic logs from the past 18 months. Carver sat down across from her without preamble. He had coffee. He didn't offer her any this time, which she noted as a different kind of social signal than Torres's offering. Not rudeness, but the absence of the performance of ease. "You found something," he said. It wasn't a question. "The radio encryption variant," she said. "It didn't originate in this network. It appeared in this network's communications approximately 9 months ago, which is after the network was already operational. Before that, the network used standard commercial encryption that's widely available. We know that. The variant they switched to 9 months ago is a modified version of a protocol developed by a defense contractor for a classified communications program. The modification is specific enough that it didn't come from reverse engineering. It came from someone with access to the original design documentation." Carver set his coffee down. "The contractor program," he said. "I can give you the program designation. It's in a procurement report I found in the archive, unclassified version, which is how I accessed it. The classified version of that report would tell you who had access to the design documentation." "You got this from the unclassified procurement report?" "I got the program designation from the unclassified report. The rest is inference." She looked at him. "But it's tight inference." I was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've been awake since when?" 5:12. "And you've been doing this since?" "Since 6:15. I needed time to think before I started pulling data." He looked at the terminal. At the comparison she'd built, 2 columns of signal characteristics, annotated, cross-referenced, with a note at the bottom in her handwriting that was precise and small and completely legible. "Vance," he said. "Yeah. I'm going to ask you something professionally. Ask. When this investigation closes, when the network is rolled up and the 36 systems are accounted for and the people responsible are facing whatever they're going to face, what do you want?" She looked at him. It was the second time in 12 hours someone had asked her a version of that question. Hayes had asked it obliquely. Carver was asking it directly, which was consistent with everything she'd observed about him. "I want to keep doing this," she said. "This specifically. The analysis. The operational application of it. Being in the field with the capability to change outcomes." She paused. "I don't want to do it as a support attachment." "You want a formal designation." "I want to be where I'm actually useful, whatever designation that requires." Carver picked up his coffee. "The DIA has a program. It's small, 8 people currently. They work network interdiction, integrated analysis, and operational support. The people in it do what you did yesterday, but with resources and authorization and a team built around the function." He drank. "I'm going to recommend you for evaluation." She looked at him. "That's not a promise," he said. "The evaluation is real, and it's hard, and people fail it." "I know. You're not going to tell me you won't fail it." "I'm going to tell you I've been preparing for something like it for 3 years without knowing exactly what I was preparing for." She looked at the terminal. "That's all I can honestly say." He nodded, set the coffee down, stood up. "The contractor program designation," he said. "Write it down." She wrote it on the notepad beside the terminal, tore the page off, handed it to him. He looked at it, folded it, put it in his pocket. "Briefing at 9, he said. "Hayes wants the full analysis walked through with the investigation team." She nodded. He walked away. She turned back to the terminal and kept working. The 9 o'clock briefing had 12 people in it, which was 11 more than she was accustomed to having as an audience. Hayes at the head, Cross to the right, Carver and Forsyth, and 3 people from Carver's investigation team. 2 JAG officers whose presence indicated the case was already being built for prosecution. A signals intelligence specialist who had been flown in overnight and who looked at her analysis of the encryption variant with an expression that moved through skepticism into something quieter and more careful. She walked them through it in order. Not the way someone walks through a presentation, no slides, no structured delivery, just the analysis as she'd built it, section by section, in the language she'd used to write it. Precise, qualified, with the uncertainty clearly marked and the confidence levels explicit. The signals specialist interrupted her at the encryption section. "The program designation," he said. "Where did you get that?" "Unclassified procurement report archived at FOB Kestrel. That report doesn't contain enough technical detail to make the connection you made. The report contains the program parameters and the contractor designation. The technical connection came from comparing those parameters to the signal characteristics in the traffic logs." She looked at him. "The comparison is documented in Section 4. He turned to Section 4 of the binder copy she'd provided. "Read it." His expression went through something that she recognized as a professional recalibration. The same thing Cross had done, the same thing Harris had done, the same thing Hayes had done, each in their own register. "This is correct," he said. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just the flat acknowledgement of someone who checked the work and found it sound. Forsyth made a note. She continued. The full walkthrough took 90 minutes. When she finished, Hayes looked at the room. "Questions?" The JAG officer on the left, a woman, sharp-featured, the kind of methodical intensity that prosecution required, said, "The repeat signature. The subject. How confident are you in the connection between the facility authorization and the network's supply chain?" "High confidence that the authorization placed the subject in direct contact with the facility pre-fire. Moderate confidence that the contact was intentional and part of the network structure rather than coincidental. The investigation will need to close the gap between moderate and high." She paused. "The gap is closable. The 24-month authorization review that Colonel Hayes ordered will likely produce additional instances. Pattern plus opportunity plus result is a strong evidentiary foundation." "You're not a lawyer." "No, but I've read enough case files to understand what makes evidence useful." The JAG officer looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote something down. Hayes closed the briefing at 10:42. As the room cleared, he held up one hand without looking up from his notes. "Vance, stay." The room emptied to Cross, Carver, Hayes. Hayes put his pen down. "The evaluation Carver mentioned to you this morning." She kept her face neutral, which took a specific small effort. "Sir?" "I've already made the recommendation. Carver will follow with his. The evaluation window opens in 6 weeks. He looked at her. "The 6 weeks in between, you're on Cross's element. Full designation, not attached. Permanent operational member." Cross said nothing, but she could feel the quality of his silence. Not surprised, not protesting. Present. "Yes, sir," she said. "The sector analysis. The full document stays in our possession for the investigation. Your encrypted copy stays with you. You will not share it with anyone outside this room without my authorization." He paused. "Which means you'll continue updating it and will continue having access to it." "Understood." Hayes looked at her for a long moment. The specific look of someone who was deciding whether to say the thing they were thinking or the professional version of it. He said the thing he was thinking. "Vance, what happened to your friend in Helmand, Marcus Hale?" His voice was entirely flat. Not cold. Flat. The way people went flat when they were carrying something they'd learned to carry efficiently. "I pulled his record this morning." She waited. "He was a good operator," Hayes said. "His after-action reviews showed strong tactical instinct. His team leaders rated him consistently high." He paused. "He deserved better than an unidentified sniper on a ridge nobody looked at carefully enough." She stood with that. "Yes," she said. "He did." "You've been looking at ridges carefully for 3 years." "Yes, sir." "Last night you made a shot that kept 4 aircrew alive." He held her gaze. "I don't know if that's the math you run, but it's the math I run." She didn't have a response that was professional and accurate at the same time. So she said nothing. She let it be what it was. Not a trade, not a balance, not a closure. Just a fact that sat alongside another fact, both of them real, neither canceling the other. Hayes picked up his pen. Dismissed. The investigation moved fast after that, which was unusual, and which Hayes had apparently forced through channels with the particular authority of someone who understood that speed was the only defense against containment pressure from people with something to protect. The 24-month authorization review produced 7 additional instances of the repeat signature, 7 more movement authorizations for convoys that had traveled through sectors adjacent to the network's operational area. 3 of those convoys were cross-referenced against incident reports and produced connections that the JAG officers called significant, and that Maya, reading the summary Torres shared with her, would have called obvious if she'd had the data 3 months earlier. The subject, whose name she knew and had known since she'd pulled the second document, and which she did not say aloud in any setting because names before charges were fuel for the wrong kind of fire, was placed on administrative hold pending investigation within 72 hours of the Kestrel debrief. Carver's team executed the formal interview 4 days later. Forsyth fought the restricted distribution for exactly 46 hours, which was 2 hours less than Hayes had predicted, and then stopped fighting it. She didn't know why he stopped and didn't ask. The investigation was above her need to know in its specifics, and she respected that boundary because she understood what boundaries were for. She spent the 6 days after the debrief running with Cross's team on 2 smaller operations that didn't go sideways: a route survey in the Kunar Valley's northern approach, and a personnel recovery exercise that came off cleanly and without incident. On the route survey, Cross put her on point for the terrain assessment portion, which was a formal acknowledgement delivered through action rather than words. She took the position without comment and did the work. Harris ran beside her for most of the survey. They didn't talk much. They'd found a working language that didn't require a lot of words, which was the most functional language she'd developed with any teammate in her career. He read terrain the way she read terrain, not the same instincts, but compatible ones. And compatibility in the field was worth more than agreement. On the evening of the 6th day, they were at the FOB's perimeter edge, the place where the floodlighting fell off and the dark started, sitting on a low wall with their boots off, because Harris's left foot had developed a blister the size of a quarter that he was airing out with the stoicism of someone who found complaining actively distasteful. Carver's team made an arrest, Harris said, not looking at her, looking at the dark. She'd heard. I know. The subject, State Department. He paused. The JAG brief said 4 counts: procurement fraud, material support, conspiracy, and 1 more I didn't catch. Obstruction, she said. The investigation of the facility fire. Someone filed the closure report. He absorbed that. The 36 systems. 14 recovered in an operation 2 days ago in Kaost. 8 more in a compound near the Pakistan border. The remaining 14 are still outstanding. She paused. The network didn't have time to use them. The timeline they would have accelerated to got disrupted when the investigation moved faster than they anticipated. Harris looked at his foot, at the blister. So the math works out, he said. Some of it. The Black Hawks from the extraction, the flight crews. They don't know anything happened, she said. As far as they're concerned, it was a modified approach route on a routine extraction. You're okay with that? She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about anything. Yes. The outcome is what mattered. The accounting doesn't need to be public. He put his boot back on, slowly, carefully, in the way of someone managing a specific discomfort. You're going to pass the evaluation, he said. I haven't taken it yet. You're going to pass it. He tied the lace. And then you're going to go somewhere that uses you the way you should have been used from the beginning. She looked at the dark beyond the perimeter. Maybe, she said. Not maybe. Harris. Yeah. I've been wrong about timelines before. She paused. I planned for 6 months and still almost missed the Kandahar connection. But you didn't miss it. I almost did. He looked at her. Almost doesn't count. Almost counts when the margin determines whether people live or die. He was quiet. Then, so you keep the margin? I keep the margin. He nodded. Like that was a complete answer, which she supposed it was. Cross found her at the range on the morning of the 7th day. She was running dry fire drills at 500 meters because the range was empty at 0600, and empty ranges at 0600 were one of the few consistently quiet things available in the field. The drills were mechanical and repetitive and useful in the particular way that only things with a direct functional application could be useful. Not peaceful, not meditative, just precise. He stood behind her for a moment before speaking. She heard him approach and identified the footfall pattern and cataloged it and kept her eye on the target. "You don't have to be doing that," he said. "I know. The evaluation's 6 weeks out. The evaluation doesn't measure what the drills are for." She completed the sequence and lowered the rifle. "I ran these drills the week before the deployment. They're for me, not for the evaluation." He moved up beside her and looked at the target. A standard silhouette at 500, with the specific marking pattern she used. Not scoring rings, but reference points at the edges of the vital zone that told her more about her position and breathing than a ring score would. "I'm putting a formal request in," he said, "for the DIA program. My recommendation, in writing, for your evaluation." She looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." He looked at the target. "I'm doing it because it's accurate. Your performance on this operation warrants a full endorsement, and a full endorsement is what I'm giving." He paused. "I'm also including a note acknowledging the 3 weeks you spent as support attached, and what that characterization cost operationally. Cross. It's in the record, Vance. It should be in the recommendation." She understood what he was doing, not flagellating himself. He wasn't built for that, and she wouldn't have respected it if he were. I was being accurate. Accurate about the error. Accurate about the correction. Accurate about the cost. It was the same thing he expected from his team, and it was the thing she'd been expecting from the institution for 3 years without receiving it. She received it now. "Thank you," she said. She said it plainly, without qualification, because it was plainly true. He nodded once. "One more thing," he said. She waited. "Marcus Hale." He said it carefully, the way people said names they'd learned mattered. "I looked him up after Hayes mentioned him in the debrief. His record. You didn't need to do that." "No, I did it because I wanted to understand what you built and why." He turned and looked at her directly. "He had a daughter, Hale. She's 9 now." She hadn't known that. She hadn't looked. There were some things she'd made a deliberate decision not to look at, because the weight of them, fully known, would be weight she carried in her shooting hand. She stood with it for a moment. "I didn't know that," she said. "I know you didn't." He was quiet. "She's in Georgia. Her mother remarried. She's okay, from what the record shows." He paused. "I thought you should know she's okay." She looked at the target at 500 meters, at the reference point she'd marked on the vital zone. She thought about a 9-year-old girl in Georgia who would never know that 1,400 meters from a south ridgeline in the Hindu Kush, on an evening when the light was going and the wind was inconsistent and the target was partially behind cover, someone had been careful enough and prepared enough and precise enough to matter. That was the right distance for that kind of knowledge. Far enough to not be weight, close enough to be real. "Thank you," she said again. He left the range. She turned back to the target and ran the drill again from the beginning. The evaluation happened 7 weeks later, not 6, because a scheduling conflict pushed it back and no one apologized for that, and she didn't expect them to. She traveled to the evaluation site alone, with her kit and her rifle in the encrypted copy of the sector analysis that she'd continued updating through the remaining deployment weeks. The evaluation was 8 days. She had been told it was hard, and it was not in the way that things were hard when you were unprepared for them, but in the way that things were hard when they were designed to find the exact limit of what you were capable of and push it until it either held or broke. Hers held. She passed with a margin that the evaluating officer described as notable and that she received without comment, because comment would have been performance, and she had no interest in performance. Carver called her 2 hours after the results came through. She was sitting in the same kind of plastic chair that existed at every military installation, outside a different building, in a different country, with her kit at her feet. "Welcome to the program," he said. "Thank you. You start in 3 weeks. There's paperwork. There's always paperwork. Your first assignment will be a desk review. 6 weeks of integrating your sector analysis with the existing case files. It's not field work." "I understand. You're not going to complain about the desk." The desk produces the field, she said. I've always understood that. He was quiet for a moment. Vance. The network. We've accounted for 31 of the 36 systems. The remaining 5 are still outstanding. The case is closed from a prosecution standpoint. We have enough. But operationally, the 5 systems are still a threat. Yes. Then the work isn't finished. No, he said. It isn't. She looked at the door of the building she was sitting outside of. At the institutional gray of it, the standardized hardware, the threshold she hadn't crossed yet. I'll be there in 3 weeks, she said. I know you will. He hung up. She sat in the plastic chair for a moment longer, not avoiding the door, just sitting with the specific quality of a moment that had taken 3 years of deliberate, unglamorous, often unacknowledged work to arrive at. She thought about Marcus Hale, briefly, specifically, with the clarity of someone who had carried a weight for long enough to know exactly how it sat. She thought about a ridge in Helmand that she hadn't looked at carefully enough. She thought about every ridge since then that she had. She stood up, picked up her kit, opened the door. The fluorescent interior looked exactly like every other interior. That was fine. She hadn't come for the setting. 8 months later, the final 5 manpad systems were located in a compound in Nuristan province through a signals intelligence thread that originated in the encryption analysis Maya had documented at FOB Kestrel. The recovery operation went without casualties. The systems were destroyed in place. The prosecution of the subject, the name on the clearance document, the repeat signature, concluded with 3 convictions on 4 counts. The 4th count was reduced on procedural grounds that had nothing to do with the evidence, which was what procedural grounds usually had nothing to do with. The JAG officer who had asked Maya about her confidence in the connection sent a brief note through channels that said only, "Your analysis held up in court, all of it." Maya read the note once and filed it. Cross's team ran 4 more operations in the sector over the following year, 2 of which she supported directly from her desk position, and 1 of which she flew back into the field for when the operational requirement exceeded what a desk could provide. Harris was on that operation. They worked the terrain together without needing to discuss how, which was the best possible measure of a working relationship in the field. When she came back from that operation, Torres met her at the transit hub and handed her coffee that was, for once, not bad. "How was it?" he said. "Clean," she said. "Everything where we expected it to be." "Because of the analysis. Because of the preparation." She drank the coffee. "The analysis is just the preparation written down." He smiled slightly. "You're going to be insufferable if this keeps working." "It keeps working because it's right, not because it's mine." He looked at her. "There's a difference." "Yes," she said. "There is." She meant it. That was the thing she'd understood since Helmand, the thing that 3 years of deliberate preparation had reinforced rather than eroded. The work wasn't about her. The work was about the outcome. She was the instrument, not the purpose, and keeping that clear was what kept the instrument accurate. She drank the coffee. She looked at the transit hub's departure board. Her flight home, the first time in 8 months she'd used that word without qualification, was in 4 hours. She had 4 hours of good light left in the day. She used them to update the analysis, because somewhere in the data there was always another ridge nobody had looked at carefully enough. And she had made a habit 3 years ago and every day since of looking. The people who are never underestimated are the ones who stopped waiting for permission to prepare.